Hey everybody, tonight we're debating whether or not there should be welfare, and we are starting right now with Mouthy Infidel's opening statement. Want to let you know, folks, Mouthy Infidel is linked in the description. He has a popular YouTube channel called Mouthy Infidel, and with that, the floor is all yours.
Yeah, I think that when people generally think about poverty, people think about the harms of poverty purely in terms of how it harms our opportunities in life. If we're growing up in poverty, we're less likely to have access to a good education. We're less likely to have access to costly enrichment activities, less likely to have access to quality tutoring or even just social circles that might have good opportunities present in them. And I think that this is certainly very important to think about when we're thinking about the harms of poverty. However, I think that the harm of poverty actually goes significantly deeper than this. So scientists and epidemiologists are increasingly finding that poverty actually has strongly detrimental, permanent, irreversible effects on our brains, on our bodies. Poverty can make it more likely for us to develop a heart disease. Poverty makes it more likely for us to develop diabetes. Poverty shortens our lifespan. The stress associated with poverty literally harms the physical development of our brains. And I think that Elizabeth Stoker summed this up very well when she made the analogy that poverty is like lead. It physically harms us. It makes us sick. Poverty is, simply put, a poison. It is a very miserable predicament to be in. Now, how does this relate to welfare? Well, if you look at census data, about 50% of the population simply doesn't work. These people are classified as non-workers. It's about half of all people. And you might think, well, the solution is if people can't find jobs to just, create more jobs. Maybe if we let the free market work its magic, it would create enough jobs so that nobody lives in poverty. Which is a tempting line of thought. But the problem with this is that the vast majority of this, when you break down this non-worker category, are people who are disabled, too disabled to work, people who are like very elderly, people who are children, people who are caretakers and are too busy taking care of a sick or a disabled family member to work. And these people are people who I think a decent society can acknowledge shouldn't be compelled through threat of poverty to be forced to enter the labor market in order to receive an income and obviously not be in poverty. However, because a totally free market doesn't distribute money to people unless they work, these people are simply locked out of the labor market. And therefore, the only way to avoid dooming these groups of people, these math swaths of the population to poverty, is to provide some mechanism through which, via taxation, we can provide a income to these people that is not conditional upon their participation in the labor force. And I think that is fundamentally welfare. So that's that's basically my argument.
Thank you very much, Ethan. We will kick it over to Yaron Brook for his opening statement. Do want to give him an introduction first, and also want to remind you folks that both Mouthy and Yaron Brook are linked in the description. So as you're listening throughout this debate at any point in time, you can click on their link in the description. And that includes if you're listening to the Modern Day Debate podcast, as we also link our guests in the description there. Now for Yaron's introduction. Thank you very much, Yaron, for your patience. Yaron Brook is the host of the Yaron Brook Show, renowned best-selling author, and world-class speaker. Brook's podcast can be heard on the Yaron Brook Show at Spreaker and YouTube. Brook was the executive director of the Ayn Rand Institute, ARI, for 17 years, from 2000 to 2017. He remains chairman of the board of ARI and its primary spokesperson. So with that, thanks so much for being with us tonight, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Mouthy, I guess. I'm not going to argue that poverty is a good thing. We're going to agree on that. Poverty sucks. But it's also true that poverty is the state in which human beings have lived forever. Up until about 250 years ago, everybody, with the exception of maybe a small number of aristocrats, lived under poverty that is indeed hard to imagine the extent of that poverty as compared in the world we live in today. You would have to go to places in Africa, places in Asia, to even see the kind of poverty that we all basically lived under 250 years ago. Yeah, life expectancy is low. I mean, indeed, the poor today have far dramatically better lives than anybody did 250 years ago. They live longer, they live healthier, they live in relative luxury. They have running water, flushing toilets, electricity, iPhones, many of them, air conditioning, automobiles, at least if we're talking about the United States. So poverty sucks. Today's poor in the United States are far better off than poor people have ever been in all of human history. And yeah, there's a lot of them who can't work. Some of them choose not to work for a variety of reasons. We can talk about the role welfare has in providing motivation not to work and providing incentives not to work. Some of them are old, yeah, but they had a lifetime to save, so there's no reason they should be poor. Some of them are sick. Hopefully they have family members who can take care of them. And yeah, there are lots of other reasons people might be poor. The question fundamentally is this. Two questions. One is, the fact that somebody's poor, how does that create a claim on me? How is their suffering, and I accept all this suffering as possible, how is their suffering, even if they cannot find work, a demand on me? Morally, that sounds offensive. The idea that because you are struggling, you are hurting, you have a hard time, somehow you should be able to steal, take my money from me in order to nourish or facilitate your need. So I don't think anybody should be forced to work, and I don't believe anybody should be forced to pay somebody to live, because that's what taxation is. It is force. It's not voluntary. The whole point is that it's forced. So yes, it's a bad situation, and it does not. The fact that you are in a bad situation does not give you a right to my stuff. I have two objections to welfare. First, it's immoral, and secondly, it's impractical. It's immoral. First reason it's immoral is because it takes what I produce, what I create, what I make, and it uses coercion and force to take that away from me. It is theft that is somehow be legitimized by the democratic process. But if we did a one-on-one, if Mouthy came to me and said, I don't have money to pay my medical bills, give me money, and I said no, we wouldn't accept the idea that he could pull a gun out of me and take my money by force. But somehow, it's okay for him to go to the neighbors and get everybody to vote. And if they vote to take my money, it's not theft anymore. Now it's democracy, and it's okay. So it's the use of force. It's immoral. It's unjust. Force, I think, is bad uniformly, whether it's used by the individual or whether it's used by the state. So I think it's immoral because it takes stuff from me, but I also think it's immoral because it does harm to the recipient. It's true that to be poor is difficult, but to be poor and to receive welfare is actually worse. To be poor and to receive welfare, you are told implicitly that you're hopeless, that you depend on others for your survival, that you don't have the skill and ability to take care of yourself. If self-esteem comes from achievement, you are denied for life of self-esteem because nobody expects you to achieve anything. You don't expect yourself to achieve anything. Just accept what the government gives you. I think welfare institutionalizes people into poverty, and we can see that with the so-called war on poverty. People are stuck. They've been trained to accept the gift of poverty or the gift and quote of poverty, and not to strive for themselves and not to achieve and not to succeed and not go out there and find a job. So we're incentivizing them not to work. And it destroys, as I said, their ability to have self-esteem and therefore really their ability to be happy, to achieve happiness. Finally, welfare is impractical. It doesn't work, as we see the poverty rates in the United States now really budging in spite of gazillions of dollars thrown at poverty at both the federal, state, local levels. We see resentment and victimhood on the part of the recipient. Recipients are not exactly happy. They're not exactly flourishing. All these medical problems, all these issues with poverty, they still exist in spite of, how long have we had 50 years now? Yeah, 50 years of a war on poverty since the late 1960s. We discourage people from saving by promising them Social Security, really the biggest pyramid scheme in all of human history. And yet, has it made them that better off? Many people retire and suddenly discover, wait a minute, Social Security is not that much money. Can I really live on this? And yet, we've taught them not to save their entire life. The lack of saving destroys economic activity. Indeed, jobs are created through saving and investment, and yet a whole economic policies around welfare are targeted at consumption.
Got about 30 seconds left.
Denial of saving and investment. You can see that through, we tax the middle class and the rich who tend to save and invest, and we provide money to the relative poor who tend to consume and not save and invest. Welfare programs have been expanded to include much of the middle class, not just poor people. And of course, they have been failures, and inevitably, they must be failures. So I think overall, poverty is a bad thing. The solution to poverty is a free market. It does create lots of jobs and creates good jobs, creates high-paying jobs. And yes, children don't have to work. That is the beauty of capitalism. Capitalism liberated children from work. All of human history, the last 100,000 years, children have worked on the farm and ultimately in factories. And then capitalism provided their parents with jobs that paid well enough that these children could then go out and get an education and still have food on their tables.
We're at about 6.5 minutes for that opening statement.
Yeah, so that's fine. So if you want to get people out of poverty, the only system in all of human history to get people out of poverty is free market capitalism.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for those opening statements. I want to remind you folks, our guests are linked in the description, and we're thrilled to have them. So we want to remind you to be your regular friendly selves in the chat, criticizing the arguments instead of the person. And so thanks so much, gentlemen. The floor is all yours for that open conversation.
Yeah, so I guess there's a lot to address there. I'll try not to, try to address it all because I don't want to just be exchanging monologues, but I'll try to sort of address the broad strokes of what you're saying. So you made a few appeals to the idea that just empirically, the practicality of welfare. So you say that the empirical evidence points to the idea that welfare is impractical, that free markets are the best way to alleviate poverty. I, of course, take serious issue with this. I think that if you look at like cross-national correlations, for example, there is a very strong and undeniable correlation between more social spending and greater poverty reduction. What did you say? Oh, sorry, I froze.
You froze.
Am I back?
Everything, but there was a lag, but you're caught up now.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so from what I'm familiar with, the OECD statistics that I'm familiar with, when you measure the relationship between the final poverty level as a percentage of market poverty level and net social spending, the relationship between welfare and poverty reduction across countries is an R-squared correlation of 0.64, which seems pretty significant. You appealed to the idea of sort of this concept of like dynamic effects of, well, if you didn't have welfare, old people might save more, sick people might have families that take care of them. The problem is we can see empirically that when we reduce how much we spend on welfare, these things simply aren't enough to compensate for the massive reduction in poverty that welfare brings. You appealed to the war on poverty being a failure. I think this is a very common thing I hear, but the main problem that I see with this is what you're appealing to is the fact that if you look at the official poverty rate, it hasn't budged much since the war on poverty started. But the problem is the official poverty rate does not take into account things like capital gains or non-cash benefits, such as public housing, Medicaid, SNAP, the Earned Income Tax Credit. And so as a result, families who benefit from tax measures such as the Earned Income Tax Credits or income supports such as SNAP appear to be no better off than families who are not enrolled in these programs, according to the official poverty metric. So in other words, these statistics are basically saying that if you measure the effectiveness of federal anti-poverty policies using a measure of poverty that explicitly ignores the impact of those same policies, then the impact seems small. And yeah, of course, I would agree with that, but I think it's a faulty usage of statistics. And an analysis by the Council of Economic Advisors shows that when safety net programs are taken into account using something called the disposable income poverty rate, the poverty rate actually fell from 26% in 1967 to 16% in 2012, which is a reduction of more than 1/3, which I see as pretty significant. And I guess just the other point, we could get to more stuff such as the saving and investment stuff, which I also obviously disagree with. But to keep it short, I'll just address one more thing, which is you talked about the harms that it causes to welfare recipients and how it institutionalizes poverty. And I think this is sort of an antiquated way of viewing things. So, for example, there was a really interesting literature review in 2018 by somebody whose name there's no way I'm going to correctly pronounce. I think the name is Iona Marinescu. And basically what they found was that various unconditional cash transfer programs tend to boost incomes, boost health, boost education. And despite the widespread belief that welfare benefits encourage people not to work, there's just no substantial outcome to that effect at all. So programs that give out cash unconditionally, like payouts from the Alaska Permanent Fund, which distributes natural resource revenue to the people of Alaska, the reduction in employment was like nowhere to be found. And one other thing is that in a recent experiment, you may have heard of this, some philanthropists randomly selected 125 residents of poor neighborhoods in the city of Stockton, California, and gave them $500 in unconditional cash transfers. And instead of working less, the people who got the cash actually worked more. Interviews with the Stockton residents who received the $500 a month spent it almost entirely on necessities like food and utilities. And in interviews, they reported feeling more confident, more engaged, even more entrepreneurial. And people who got the money were healthier, happier, less anxious, more stable and well off, et cetera. And so I think what this suggests is that contrary to this antiquated view about poverty being a product of this, sort of culture of poverty that, keeps people with this dependent mindset, it seems to be the case that poverty keeps people down through a variety of day-to-day difficulties and hassles and bills, which make it very hard for poor people to better their situations. Poverty in the... Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Just to be sure that we move...
Yeah,
we'll kind of try to work on getting each of these exchanges to shrink it down as we go.
Yeah, this is like my last point. So the basic idea here is that, contrary to this idea of like, the culture of dependency or whatever, it seems that poverty keeps people down through a flurry of like day-to-day difficulties and hassles that make it harder for poor people to better their situations. It makes them harder for them to go to school to become a nurse instead of a cashier, makes it harder for them to move to a better neighborhood, to look for a better job, etc. And so instead of working on their futures, people in poverty are trapped by the need to pay the bills of the moment. And therefore, through this model, providing welfare actually gives people the breathing room that is required for them to focus on the future and actually meaningfully better their situation. So that's all I'd say.
So we could go back and forth with empirical studies. I mean, I could be citing the Finnish study that did universal basic income and found almost no impact one way or the other. And there are plenty of studies that show the detrimental effect of welfare recipients. But look, if you were right and welfare worked so well, then we wouldn't hear constant complaining and demands for more and more and more and more. Poverty rates around the world, if you actually look at poverty rates around the world, if you take away the relative minor differences between the United States and Europe, but you look at the globe, the places in the world that have reduced the most poverty have done it without any welfare. So China has reduced poverty rates by, almost 1 billion people have come out of poverty in China over the last 40 years with basically no welfare, zero welfare. So in spite of the idea that China's communist or socialist, there's almost no transfer payments in China. Same is true of India, which has almost no transfer payments and yet has seen a massive reduction in poverty. I'm not even going to mention a place like South Korea, which has gone from being as poor as North Korea to being as rich as Europe, or Taiwan, or Singapore, or Hong Kong, which has almost no welfare and has yet seen a massive reduction. I like the way you use stats. I wish more people would do that on your side, because the way you use stat, inequality hasn't increased in the United States very much over the last 30 to 40 years. Because if you include transfer payments and all the things that you included there, inequality has not gone up. So you can challenge Stiglitz and other Nobel Prize winners in terms of how they do the stats on inequality. It's a shame that people are using statistics in the way that seems convenient to them at the time. Yes, by some measures of poverty has gone down in the United States. It doesn't feel that way because people complain and people make a big deal as if poverty is as bad or worse than it has ever been. But look, all of this is, in my view, all the stats and all this is a waste, because the fundamental point here is that we'd be far better off without welfare, but I can't show you that. I can't point to an alternate universe in which welfare never came into being. You point out that poverty has declined from 20-something% to 16, I think you said, which I believe, the numbers seem right. How do we know what would have happened if there was no welfare? How do we control for the non-existence of welfare? I mean, I can speculate. I think you speculate quite well that poverty would actually be lower than 16%. If we match the rate of decline in poverty in countries that were growing at GDP growth of 4, 5, 6%, which I think the United States could achieve, poverty would have shrunk significantly more than it has shrunk. Indeed, growth of GDP contributes to reduction in poverty far more than any redistribution programs. So the studies, the stats that you are mentioning, I think are correct. But I think it's a question of how we interpret them and what we actually make of them. In my view, if you eliminated poverty, if you lower taxes in accordance with that, if you deregulated the economy, if you made an economy actually free, you would have dramatically higher wealth creation, dramatically greater business activity, massive numbers of new jobs, which many of those jobs would be taken by welfare recipients today, driving them out of welfare. Productivity would increase dramatically. As productivity would increase, wages would increase. As wages would increase, people would have much more money to be able to afford the healthcare, to afford to be able to take care of a sick cousin or a sick aunt or a sick relative, to be able to take care of all these people who supposedly fall between the cracks, who are so poor. But yet poverty is shrinking. So, there seems to be constant complaint about poverty, and yet it's shrinking significantly. So, all of this old, sick, and other could be easily taken care of by the difference in economic growth if you eliminated the heavy intervention of government in the rest of the economy. So the solution to poverty is two at the end of the day. One is job creation, wealth creation, and second is private charity. So to the extent that some people do indeed fall between the cracks, I think it would be a tiny fraction of the number that today are defined as poor. To the extent that there are people who fall between the cracks, those people will be taken care of through family and through private charity. Americans have been some of the most generous people in all the history of mankind. And there's plenty of charity to take care of those people who actually need it. And charity, when it's private, is not given unconditionally the way the government does it. It's not given in the kind of bureaucracy and the inefficiency that the government does welfare. It would be more efficient. It would require those who can work to work. It would be much more linked to actual virtuous activities. And as a consequence, help people in a much more substantial way get out of poverty much faster and much more effectively.
Yeah. So, yeah, I guess there's a few things I would take issue with there. I guess to get like a smaller point out of the way, you brought up the example of Finland's universal basic income, and I am somewhat familiar with that. There were a variety of problems with Finland's universal basic income. It only lasted for like 2 years. So like the effects that we've seen, we have very limited data to draw off of, whereas, programs that have been in existence for a much longer time, like Alaska's Permanent Fund, and have been more extensively studied, seem to have a lot better outcomes. There's a lot of like bureaucratic problems in Finland as well. And Finland is widely regarded as an example of a place where universal basic income failed because of a variety of very, conditional and bureaucratic factors that were specific to Finland. But if you look at other experiments and social spending more generally, this seems to be undeniably the exception rather than the rule. And so you talked about how if welfare was working, we wouldn't see complaining or demands for more. I don't know how I feel about that argument. I feel like in large part, the reason for there were some interesting papers showing that there's some correlation between like higher levels of income inequality and more popularity in like populist right-wing and left-wing populist parties. I feel like a lot of the fervor of among many people with regards to they feel like we're not spending enough on social spending is driven by largely the fact that we don't do enough social spending. If we look at places like the Nordic countries, for example, these places are very cohesive. People seem very content. There's not a lot of social discontent, or at least to the extent there is in the US, and it's because they engage in sufficient social spending that people generally feel as if they're taken care of. You talk about how the places in the world, if you like zoom out from, places like the United States and Europe that have reduced poverty the most, did so through capitalism. And I certainly agree that market mechanisms, I'm not like advocating for a planned economy here. I certainly agree that market mechanisms do have a substantial role in eliminating poverty. The question then becomes, do countries which allow for market mechanisms and social spending and have become rich through market mechanisms, can these countries, if they implement social spending, reduce poverty more than countries which have market mechanisms and don't implement social spending alongside that? And the answer seems to be yes, based on correlations among OECD countries between social spending and poverty reduction. You talked about we can't like we don't have like a control example. Like we don't have an example of a place with no welfare that we can like really look at to compare this. But it seems like the further we go, at least among like OECD countries, for example, the further that wealthy countries go from social spending and from welfare and towards the direction of sort of what you're talking about, the less poverty is reduced. In fact, there was an interesting there was an interesting paper from like 2014 from the Institute for the Study of Labor. It was titled The Welfare State and Anti-Poverty Policy in Rich Countries. And it reviewed a bunch of different papers, and it found that, quote, no advanced economy has achieved a low level of poverty with a low level of social spending. So it seems like the further we go in the direction that you're advocating for, while we don't have a perfect example of what you're advocating for, the further we go, the less effective we're able to reduce poverty. One more thing that you brought up was charity, which is like a big example. And it seems like, so I mentioned earlier that if you look at the correlation among OECD countries between market poverty level and net social spending, or the final poverty level is a percentage of market poverty level and net social spending, you see that the relationship between welfare and poverty reduction is about 0.64. If you look at the same data, you can see that the correlation between the post-transfer poverty rate and net private social spending, in other words, charity, is about a R-squared correlation of 0.0. It seems like it seems like a collective action problem where people without some coercive element or without like taxation and welfare, not enough people just voluntarily choose to help out poor people to substantially reduce poverty. And I guess just the final point is that you brought up wages and jobs. Like if we had a free market, people would be earning more people would have jobs, and so people would have more money. I could grant that for the sake of argument. I'm sure we could quibble over the details about that. I could grant that for the sake of argument and still say that based on the data that we currently have, it seems like a free market, deregulated economy, even if that was the best way to raise jobs and raise wages, with social spending and welfare alongside that, would seem more effective at reducing poverty than just the free market with no social spending. That seems to be what the empirical evidence suggests.
I'm gonna the next one we're gonna like limit it to maybe like 3.5 to 4 minutes or so. We'll give Yaron the same amount of time to respond. And thanks so much, guys. And reminder, folks, our guests are linked in the description. Go ahead, Yaron.
All right. I mean, it's hard to attain everything. I apologize because Mouthy's going long, but on almost every point, take the so-called social cohesion that exists in some of these other countries that don't result in, right-wing populist movements. Take Sweden. Sweden is the country that people love to love, right? The people are happy and is there real social cohesion in Sweden? Really? Has anybody visited Sweden recently over the last 5 years? I have. I've been there several times. If you look at the right-wing populists, they actually have 20 to 30% of the vote in Sweden. Not very happy. If you want to have a discussion about the effect of Islam or Muslims on Swedish society, you can't even speak because they'll shush you up because it's just not acceptable to even talk about the issue and raise the issue. So I'm very skeptical about this notion of Sweden being some kind of heaven, either socially, economically, from a poverty perspective or any perspective for that matter. And Sweden is the last, while Sweden redistributes a lot of wealth, it has actually been cutting its welfare over the last few decades as a consequence of the fact that the welfare spending they had almost drove them bankrupt. Let me take a different tact here because I think we could argue about the details. I mean, if you go to Asian countries, you can find very little social spending and very low rates of poverty in places like Korea and Taiwan. Europe, there seems to be some correlation between social spending and the number of poor. In China, again, in developing countries, there's zero social spending, and yet poverty has shrunk dramatically. I'd give one more example, which I think is important. I would give the example, maybe the most important example, is the United States and Europe in the 19th century, which saw dramatic, very fast reductions in the rate of poverty, with almost no state intervention, with almost no redistribution of wealth. And indeed, you could argue that with the establishment of the modern welfare state in the United States in the 1930s, and in Europe, depending exactly where, Germany in the late 19th century, rest of Europe sometime in the 20th century, you saw a massive reduction in economic growth, massive reduction in wealth creation, and generally a lower standard of living than otherwise was possible. Europe is relatively poor to the United States, and part of the relative poverty that Europe has vis-a-vis the US is a consequence of the fact that they redistribute massive amounts of wealth instead of investing it and instead of encouraging entrepreneurship. But I want to step back from this kind of line of argument. We could continue it if you want, but I want to step back. Let's even assume that everything that Mouthy says is true. Let's assume that all these poverty programs, quote, work in the sense that they reduce poverty. And if we did more of them, poverty would reduce even more. I would argue they're still wrong. That is, the standard of goodness is not poverty. The standard of goodness is not how many poor people there are. The system that we should be thinking about creating, the kind of society that we want, is not a society that is correlated somehow with the rates of poverty. Early 19th century America, well, let's say mid-century, let's get outside of slavery, let's say late 19th century America, had very, very high rates of poverty. And yet it was an amazing place in which innovation and production and the rate of growth and the rate of reduction in poverty was some of the highest in all of human history. Why does poverty matter? What makes poverty important? I don't care, to be kind of a little outrageous, I don't care about the poor. I care that ambitious, moral, rational people, right, have the opportunity to achieve happiness, success in their lives. I want people to be able to live the best life that they can live. Every person, rich, middle class, poor. I don't care about the rich. I really don't care about the middle class. And I don't care about the poor. I don't care about any of those groups. I care about individuals having the freedom, having the ability, having the opportunities to achieve the most in their lives. If we look at what welfare does to children, the way, again, it institutionalizes a mindset so that children of welfare recipients are likely to be welfare recipients. Not in a marketplace, not when the culture is a culture that expects them to work, that expects them to take care of themselves, that expects them to achieve, to advance, to progress, to take responsibility for their own lives. Not in a culture where maybe their parents are getting private charity. And by the way, the statistics on charity are really distortive because you're taking a world in which has welfare and now you're layering on charity and you're saying that charity doesn't have an impact. Great, because the charity is minuscule as compared to the welfare state. But of course, I give exactly zero to poverty reducing charities today, right? Why? Because 50% of my income goes to that. Why would I give more, right? A big chunk of my money is already going to do that. But if I was free, I would be happy. If I didn't have to pay 50% of my taxes, I'd be happy to give to specific charities that instituted programs that made sense to me in terms of alleviating poverty, because I do care, ultimately, right, about people not being poor. But I don't care about the poor. I'd like to help children get a better education. But the welfare state denies that. The welfare state provides them with an inferior product called public education. And, I care about, why do they have all these problems health-wise? Well, a lot of it is because of the lifestyle they engage in, and the lifestyle they engage in is made possible because of welfare. Whether it's the eating habits, the lack of exercise habits, right? Now, obesity. This is the problem of poverty in the United States. It's a problem of obesity. They're so poor, they eat too much. That's not healthy, right? But if you, for example, if you linked certain behaviors, as a private charity probably will, to the ability to get help, you might have a healthier population, and maybe problems of health would reduce. So I want an individualist response rather than a collectivist response. I don't view the poor as all equal. Some people deserve to be poor. Some people do not deserve to be poor. some people, some people benefit from charity, from welfare. My guess is that 90+% of them do not in the big picture. And you can poo-poo the kind of economic growth that capitalism achieves. But if you look again at the fact that 98% of humanity was poor 250 years ago, less than 8% is extremely poor today. Almost all of that is a consequence of markets, of wealth creation, of capitalism. Imagine if we had more of that. Imagine if those job-creating, wealth-creating engines, there was much more of that. Poverty would be reduced dramatically. So I think the solution is freedom. And I think part of the challenge here is I challenge the moral assumption that it's okay to use force to take money from me and give it to other people, even if it, quote, works.
Thanks very much. And Mouthy, for this next one, just to constrain, I know that you've got a round in the chamber ready to fire at each of Yaron's arguments. However, just if you want to pick the ones you most want to discuss and just choose those, we'll kind of shrink it down. I'm going to put a timer for about 3 minutes just to try to kind of get the back and forth going more quickly.
I'll try to really speed run the points. Okay. Yeah, sure. So you mentioned this idea of charity is sort of crowded out by welfare. And if we had less welfare, people would give more to charity. And that's the problem with me citing these charity statistics. The problem that I see is that if
other thing, just quickly, Mouthy, Europeans have never been charitable. So in Europe, you get zero charity. You've always received almost no charity. Americans have been incredibly charitable. And charity for poverty has declined as we become more welfare-oriented. Sorry, I just wanted to...
Yeah. So if the effect of welfare crowding out was, as you say, such that getting rid of welfare would lead to more charity that is enough to compensate for the anti-welfare effects or the anti-poverty effects of welfare, then we wouldn't see statistics that we see with regards to when we spend less and less and less on social spending across countries, we get further and further and further away from successfully addressing the problem of poverty. You briefly brought up the issue of Sweden's social cohesion and poverty. Of course, Sweden isn't perfect with regards to social cohesion or poverty, but if you look at it like relatively, if you look at statistics with regards to social cohesion or how content Swedish people are with their lives, or even relative poverty metrics or absolute poverty metrics, it just seems to be the case that Sweden is doing much better than we are, like factually. You also mentioned that Sweden is cutting welfare because of social spending almost drove them bankrupt. I don't really agree with this narrative. Social spending in Sweden was kind of increasing since the 1900s. Even in the golden age of Swedish social democracy, GDP growth was pretty healthy for the most part. So like, for example, between 1980 and 1990, GDP per capita grew in Sweden by 20%. Between like 1960 and 1970, real GDP per capita doubled in Sweden. There was a collapse in the 90s that led to the reforms that you're talking about, but I think that was more a product of deregulation of credit, bad monetary policy, other geopolitical issues happening at the same time, et cetera. So I wouldn't really pin that on social spending. You talk about how a lot of Asian countries have reduced poverty without welfare. I'm not denying that you can significantly reduce poverty without welfare. Market mechanisms do a great job at reducing poverty. However, it seems to be the case that market mechanisms plus social spending reduces poverty more than just the market mechanisms that has reduced poverty significantly in the Asian countries. You talk about GDP growth and entrepreneurship. In terms of entrepreneurship, the economist Gareth Olds has done a lot of interesting work demonstrating that more social spending can actually lead to more entrepreneurship because it allows people to feel more comfortable taking risks and allows people to save more for investment. In terms of GDP growth, I think that reducing inequality has a pretty significant leads to a pretty significant reduction in increase in GDP growth because it allows people to develop their human capital more and so on. In terms of morals, I think that my moral case, even if it was all correct, you said even if it works, then it shouldn't matter because of the morals. I think that our morals align more than you might think. I am a psychological egoist. I think that we're all out to further make the best society for ourselves possible. But I think that having a society that's more cohesive, with less poverty, with less crime, with better growth, I think this is conducive to all of our own interests. And I agree that people should be trying to achieve the most in their lives possible. But I think that poverty helps people be able to do that by giving them the breathing room that they need to sort of better their circumstance, rather than being trapped by the cluster of daily hassles and bills that poverty traps them under.
Thank you very much.
I mean, we could have a debate about psychological egoism, but I'm an egoist and I don't want my money taken away from me. And if you think it's in my self-interest to give money to the poor, then convince me of that. But you don't want to convince me to give money to the poor. You want to pull out a gun and take my money by force to give to the poor. So if indeed you're an advocate of some form of egoism, then you should be promoting a voluntary system of welfare in which individuals convince one another that it's true, that it's in our self-interest to benefit. And the problem of coordination is way, way, way overstated. If you can convince me to give 20, 30, 40% of my money towards poverty reduction, and if we can create a competitive environment among charities, then you would get a far more efficient welfare system than we have today, where much of the money that goes into welfare today is eaten up by a bureaucracy and is a complete waste. So on an ethical basis, the fact that you think, or that a majority of people think, that welfare is somehow creates a good society and is egoistically better for you, doesn't give you the right to force me to fund it, right? You believe it, you fund it, that's great. So the fact that there's a collective action problem is your problem, not mine, in that sense, right? You have to convince enough people to group together to do what you think they should do. That's what collective action problems require. So if you're truly an egoist, then you shouldn't be coercing other people to do what you think is good for you. You should be letting them do what they think is good for them. Look, we could get into a whole debate about this, but there is no zero economic theory that links inequality to GDP growth, none. And I know the OECD studies that have showed inequality connected to GDP. Let me just, I think the technical word for the quality of the research there is that it's BS. It's complete. And if we had the study and I went through the statistics, because it sounds like you like to do the stats right, I could show you that the stats are BS. When you include Zimbabwe as having high inequality and the United States having high inequality, and using both of those countries on an axis, then you're going to get crazy and irresponsible results, which is exactly what these people do. Inequality, there's no economic theory linking it to GDP. Indeed, I would argue it's the opposite. It's societies in which that leave people free tend to have high inequality and also have high GDP and also have low consumption inequality, which is really the inequality that is important, which is the differences in consumption, and the difference in consumption in rich countries in high inequality countries are far smaller than what you'd expect from the income or wealth inequality. These content studies, and I notice you haven't used happiness, so that's to your credit, because happiness studies are dubious in terms of their definition of happiness. So yes,
30 seconds left.
Swedes say they're content. It's fascinating, but Swedes in America say they're content too. Swedes in America, or at least the studies I saw about Denmark, Danes in America are richer than Danes in Denmark. They are happier or they are more content than Danes in Denmark. Maybe there's something going on here with how people define content and what that means. I usually find people who are not very ambitious and who are not very entrepreneurial are very content people, and people that tend to be ambitious and entrepreneurial tend to be not very content. And Scandinavians who are super ambitious tend to not stay in Scandinavia. They tend to go to Switzerland to the UK or to the United States of America, particularly if they've made a little bit of money and don't want to be taxed at the rates that Scandinavia taxes them. So you've got a selection bias, you've got a survival bias in all of those studies. Look, at the end of the day, I think that the issue here is twofold. From a moral perspective, you're right to coerce me to provide for what you think is socially good. And I think the second point is, what is going to create a better society, a society in which we coerce each other based on what we think is going to be, or a society in which we leave people free to make choices for themselves, that includes the poor and that includes the wealthy, and let the dice fall where they may.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So so a few points there. So for one, you talk about how if I was truly an egoist, I should be trying to convince other people to donate to charity rather than using a coercive force like taxation and redistribution. I guess the reason why I would take issue with this is because I think that sort of part of the nature of collective action problems is that if we all had to chip into a certain thing, it makes all of us better off. However, it's simply infeasible. And we've seen empirically that just no society ever has been able to convince enough people to chip in to have the positive effects that welfare has. So even if it's coercion, even if it's involuntary, I think having people democratically decide that we are going to agree to have this coercive force, I think that can make everybody better off, even if it is coercive. I think that
utilitarian at the end.
I mean, sure, but ultimately, my dedication to utilitarian comes from my desire to personally live the best life that I can, and I think the best life for me and the best life for most people can happen in a society that is flourishing. And so, I guess a couple other points. You talked about how under charity we'd have a more efficient system. I guess I don't want to beat a dead horse, keep going over the same points, but I guess I just feel like we haven't seen that. We've seen that when we try to rely more on charity and less on welfare, the system has gotten less efficient and the outcomes related to it have gotten a lot less positive. You talked about inequality and GDP growth, or that there's no sound economic theory linking equality to GDP growth. And I agree with you that there have been some very bad studies. So some of the OECD studies that include countries like Zimbabwe have been really poor because they distort the data. There was one interesting paper from 2014 from the International Monetary Fund, which specifically included rich countries like the European countries, America, Japan, to sort of get that bias out of the way. And basically what they did is that they used a cross-country data set that distinguishes market inequality from net inequality to calculate redistributive transfers for a large number of country year observations. And what they found is that inequality is robustly correlated with faster and more durable growth for a given level of redistribution. And redistribution is generally benign, somewhat negative, but benign in terms of its impact on growth. And therefore, the combined direct and indirect effects on redistribution, including growth effects from the resulting lower inequality, are on average pro-growth. In terms of the economic theory, I would say that the economic theory is that having more equality allows people to develop their human capital more. It can actually lead to more investment because it creates more social and political stability, which makes people feel like investing is safer. And finally, in terms of the content studies, I agree that some of them can be culturally biased, but I guess pointing out that there could be a flaw in the data set isn't enough for me to abandon it. I would need to see if the cultural bias is prevalent enough and goes in a certain direction enough to negate the conclusion that I'm drawing from it. And in terms of the immigrants who are just as content in America, I think that's where the real selection bias occurs, because the kinds of people who are specifically moving to America are going to be the people who are more likely to be happy when they've moved to America. So I see a selection bias with using that argument in that way, I guess.
Thank you.
potentially the problem there is when you go to third and fourth generation Swedes and Danes in Minnesota or in places like that, where it's no longer a selection bias unless you think that it gets transferred in the genes, which I am skeptical of. I think the key here is the moral point, and we can discuss some of the empirical stuff, but the moral point that you have a collective action problem. You believe that it results in a certain thing, and you think that anything that you can convince 51% of the people is okay to do to me. My speech might be offensive enough as to cause harm to enough people so that you, in your utilitarian world, believe that my speech is causing real harm to people. Maybe it's convinced people, to vote against welfare. And as a consequence, I am a danger to poverty in the world, so we should silence me. Free speech, one can imagine, could be, is the idea of free speech in the Constitution, at least, is not based on a utilitarian framework, thank God. Thank whatever. But given that speech is not necessarily, in spite of what Mill says, always. Not everybody perceives it as good for society, put it that way. And a majority often perceives it as bad for society. And we've decided that it doesn't matter what a majority thinks. Leaving people alone and allowing them to be free and allowing them to engage in speech freely is the right thing to do on principle, and it does not require a majority in order to achieve it. I believe that is true in terms of property. I believe that is true in terms of people's work, and believe that is true in terms of my income. My life is mine. It's not yours to decide as a majority whether you think it should be deployed at X or at Y because you have a collective action problem. That is your problem, not mine. So morally, if you believe that individuals should be allowed to pursue their values, to pursue the optimal life for themselves, then you're trying to inflict your values and your way of living on me. I mean, one of the things I always tell, and I'm not accusing you of being a socialist or communist, but one of the things I often tell my people who are socialists and communists is, great, under capitalism, you can be a communist. You can go and start a commune. You can, from each according to his ability to each according to his need, and I won't interfere with you. You can start your own welfare little system as long as you don't use force to take money away, as you mentioned, I think, in California, the entrepreneur who gave people a check. Great. If private individuals want to do private charity and want to do experiments in private charity, I'm not gonna oppose that. That certainly would not be illegal under my system. But for you to force me to participate in such an experiment, and for you to then, use as justification a bunch of empirical studies, as if that should convince me that it's in my self-interest, that, whereas I can imagine what I would have done with 50% of income that was taken from me. And I think what I would have done done to my life much more, and actually maybe could have helped poor people even more. But I'm not given the opportunity to experiment, to manifest my ideas, because you're using a gun against me, because you're using force against me. So I think that morally, running your own social experiment using coercion on me is, in my view, immoral and wrong. And that to me is the ultimate, my ultimate argument against welfare. Let me just say this about charity, because you said this a couple of times. The studies that show that, when you reduce social spending, charity doesn't go up or something like that. There's only one country that has any kind of history of charity, and that is the United States. I don't know when would be the period in which we reduced social spending to such an extent that the private sector would have entered into this and charity would have been a replacement, but it hasn't been significant. The changes in social spending have been marginal. You wouldn't expect a result. My guess is that if it went to zero tomorrow, charity would increase substantially. You've got the same problem in that study that the European Bank or the World Bank did on inequality. The differences between Europe and the United States are so small in terms of social spending that to come to robust statistical conclusions about the different levels and whether social spending is being pro-growth or not is dubious statistically. And I would argue if that were the case, then Denmark would be significantly richer than the United States, and it's not. It's quite a bit poorer.
We'll give 4 minutes to each of you to kind of draw together the threads from this discussion. And so we'll kick it over to Mouthy, and after this 4 minutes from each of you, we'll jump into the Q&A. So thanks for your questions, folks. And Mouthy, the floor is all yours.
All right, so I haven't seen any data on third and fourth generation immigrants from Denmark and Sweden or Norway. I guess I could see an argument that, maybe there are some some of the selection biases carried over, maybe not through genes, but just through upbringing and, kind of, like through upbringing, I guess. If your parent immigrated to America because they wanted to be in America, they're super happy with America, and they raised you to sort of have that same outlook, you're going to report to studies looking, saying that you are more content living in America. So I guess I'm not sure. I would just have to see more data on that. With regards to the moral stuff, you said you talked about free speech, utilitarianism. You think that the majority can think some people's speech is bad, but that wouldn't justify us sort of doing away with free speech. And I agree with that. But that's because I think that free speech, even if a majority of people think it's bad, and to be clear, I'm not arguing that welfare is good because a majority of people think it's good. I'm saying it's good because of its empirical outcomes. And I think that the empirical outcomes of allowing for free speech are on the net positive for everyone in society, just like the empirical outcomes of doing welfare are net positive for society. You talk about how, my life is mine and it's immoral to inflict force on me or prevent me from living the way that I want to live. I guess this is just like a fundamental disagreement between us. I think that if you can have a coercive element that in some way uses coercion to interfere with people who, or with how people would have otherwise lived their lives in the absence of coercion, but nonetheless that the existence of that coercion creates a more prosperous society and allows every individual to live in general happier lives in a more flourishing society. I think that that is a net good, even from an egoist perspective. I think that every individual is happier when they're less likely to fall into deep poverty in some point in their lives, when they're less likely to be assaulted in the streets because of lower inequality, et cetera. So I think that coercion is not necessarily antithetical to people's interests. But I guess that's just a sort of a fundamental disagreement. You talk about how only one country has a history with charity, and that's the USA. Well, even in the USA, when we massively ramped up social spending, I sent the statistics earlier. When we massively ramped up social spending during the war on poverty, what we saw was a massive reduction in poverty. If all that welfare did was crowd out charity, and charity before that would have just been more and would have compensated, then we wouldn't have seen that massive reduction in poverty as a result of increased social spending. And as the US has spent more, we've seen that when the US spends more and more in social spending, there's a reduction in poverty. And when we reduce social spending, there's an increase in poverty as a result of that. So I just don't see any evidence that even in the US, charity has the capacity to compensate for welfare. At best, this is an unfalsifiable claim, and at worst, it's contrary to all of the available evidence that we currently have. Finally, you talked about how the studies I referenced, differences between Europe and the USA are so small, it's statistically dubious. I don't actually, I don't really think that is necessarily true. So for example, if you look at social expenditures as a percentage of GDP, it's like 30.8% in Finland, and it's like 19% in the US. That is a very stark difference. And it seems there are statistical methods that we can use to look at the differences and say, do these differences, when we use control variables and regression analysis and other statistical methods, can we see these differing levels of social expenditures and inequality having an impact on growth? And it seems that we can. Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We'll give the same amount of time to Yaron, and then we'll go into that Q&A.
Sure. Beware of these statistical methods, and particularly when the researchers have a bias. As somebody who used to do these kind of statistical stuff as a finance professor a long time ago, it's very easy to manipulate the data to get what you want. But and many of these people do. And also, if for all of you, for everybody listening, if you're going to look at statistics, look at all the studies, including those that might not correlate with the desired result. The United States, since the war on poverty, we have seen significant GDP growth. If you look at poverty rates before the war on poverty started, they had been declining. Certainly, they'd been declining since 1800, but they had been declining post-World War II and into the 1960s already. To attribute whatever poverty reduction to the welfare state, I think, is dubious, given that you had economic growth, you had levels of employment, particularly, in certain periods, levels of employment that have not been seen. You also had a significant and dramatic increase in the quality of life and standard of living. I actually think poverty in the United States is much lower than what the stats would even suggest it is, not because of welfare, but because poor people today, as I mentioned earlier, in the United States, tend to have air conditioning, because electricity is so cheap, tend to have iPhones. I mean, how do you even measure the value of an iPhone to anybody? Our estimations of poverty are very primitive and very dubious. Our estimates generally of income and wealth are very dubious because they don't take into account the massive consumer surplus that is a result of the great products that we have today. We don't know how to measure the benefit of technology has on our life. So, again, I can't run an experiment, but I would guess, and this is based on my understanding of economics and my understanding of how people behave, if we had not engaged in a war on poverty in the 1960s, my guess is poverty rates today would be dramatically lower. There'd be far more jobs. Would have been a lot more investment. There would be a lot more entrepreneurship in the United States, and the country as a whole would be richer, and individuals in it would be richer as well, including, since we're talking about them, the poor would be in a much better situation than they are today. Economic growth would have accelerated dramatically. But here's the important point. Mouthy says that according to his theory, everybody is better. Literally, everybody is better off if we have welfare. Well, I am not. I'm not. Now, I can show you all the different ways that I'm not. A lot of my income is gone. I should have had it. I could have done amazing things with it. I don't believe the correlation between inequality and crime. I don't believe that's true. I don't believe it exists. There are reasons why there's more crime in the United States than there is in Europe, and I'm not sure it has anything to do with inequality. But we'll put that aside. But I am an example of a victim of somebody who you say you want to make everybody better off. They won't be, you've got a Rawlsian thing going. Nobody is worse off because of my move, right? Everybody, well, I'm not. And I know a lot of people who are not. And I know a lot of poor people who are not. Because you might deny in the aggregate that welfare does harm to poor people. But certainly there are individuals who would, under other circumstances, be more ambitious, who would, under these free market circumstances, worked harder, who would, under free market circumstances, got a better job, forced themselves to get a better education, found better means to improve their lives, and at least at the individual level, even if you can't see it in the aggregate, there has to be an effect of incentives that has discouraged certain people and institutionalized this poverty and caused children of people who accept welfare to expect welfare in the future and not to seek out new jobs. One of the great tragedies, I think, of the welfare state and the war on poverty is what has happened to the African-American community in the United States. And the fact that so many of them now are multi-generation in poverty, continuously receiving welfare, and yet am not able to break out from that welfare. So, and I think welfare has done horrors to many poor people, and it's any utilitarian theory sacrifices some for others, and here I think you have sacrificed many too many.
Time. All right. Thank you very much, both of our guests. Want to remind you folks, a couple of things. Both of our guests are linked in the description. So if you want to hear more, you can hear more by clicking on those links below. And that includes, if you're listening to the Modern Day Debate podcast episode of this debate. As we do have a podcast, folks, check it out. And so you can find our guest links there as well. And then last, before we jump into this Q&A, we are stoked. Destiny will be returning this coming Tuesday. He'll be debating Pogan on capitalism versus Marxism. So that should be a juicy one. And don't forget to hit that subscribe and notification button so you don't miss it. So thanks for your first question. This one coming in from Robert Nasir says, if I invest capital via Super Chat, does that make it too obvious which side I support? Haha. Thanks for putting on the event, gang. Thanks very much. And want to say a huge thanks to our guests, as they are indeed linked in that description. Jonathan Honig says, in support of Yaron. Yaron. Gosh.
Yaron. You got it right the first time.
Thank you. For
Don't second guess yourself.
Thank you. Steven Steen says, in support of communism. All right. Thank you, Steven. Brad Becker says, value for value. Thanks for the debate. And go Yaron. Thank you very much. And Chali Sama says, go Yaron. And Brad Becker says, reality is greater than wishes, and says, inequality means we are free to earn wealth as we choose. Inequality is not inherently bad. Mouthy, if you want to respond to that, because it's where we're starting to get into more of the...
Can I just say that I wrote a book called Equal is Unfair, which is a book on inequality and why inequality is a bogus issue. Poverty might be a real issue, but inequality is a non-issue. But there it is right there. Equal is Unfair. You can see it there. Go buy it. It's on Amazon.
I'm going to add that. I'm going to add that in the description as well if it's not already there. We've got a number of links. And so go ahead, Mouthy, if you want to respond.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess this just kind of gets back to a broader disagreement that Yaron and I were having, which is that I fundamentally believe that the vast majority of people in society are better off when their society is flourishing, when their society is more cohesive, has greater economic mobility. And I think that these kinds of outcomes are more likely to be found in a society just sort of empirically when society is reducing inequality. I was familiar that Yaron Brook, just sort of as a matter of morals, just isn't really interested in the question of inequality. And that's why I kind of tried to tailor my arguments more so towards poverty. But yeah, I do think that inequality has a number of negative externalities that the vast majority of individuals in society are better off without. But yeah.
So if I can respond quickly, I don't think that's true. So just take economic mobility. There's no evidence to suggest that economic mobility is greater, is related to equality. In the contrary, economic mobility in the United States was far higher 100 years ago, and far higher when inequality was at its highest and in the late 19th century, early 20th century. The studies that compare the United States to Sweden or Denmark, let's say, again, I mean, you can do lots of stuff with statistics. When the gap between the rich and the poor is very small, then to be mobile means very little. When the gap is high, to be mobile means a lot. But the fact is that mobility in the United States, if we do cross-section analysis over time in the US, mobility is much higher when capitalism is thriving, and mobility gets reduced as we redistribute more wealth.
I'll give you a quick chance to respond, Ethan, because it was originally for you, and then I'll jump to the next one. We've got to give you a pithy response.
Yeah, really quickly. So I guess what I would say there is I do think that I'm not familiar with the data among the longitudinal data with regards to the United States, with regards to how inequality and mobility have been correlated. I do think that we sort of have to be cautious when we are approaching things like this, because it's very easy to see a correlation and assume a causal relationship. I generally like to avoid just, when I'm referencing data, I generally try to avoid just, bare correlations and try to incorporate papers that engage in like more statistical analysis and so on to try and control for certain variables and use dummy variables or like regression analysis and so on. However, with regards to what Yaron mentioned, which is just that when you reduce inequality, of course, it's going to look like you increase social mobility because so let's imagine like a hypothetical where it's like there's two ladders, one of which has spokes that are further away from each other. That's like a more unequal society. And the other one has sort of legs that are closer together. That's like a more equal society. And you could say that reducing those legs, or reducing the distance between the legs, of course, is going to make it look like you were climbed higher, you climbed more legs, but that's only because like they're closer together, but you haven't actually gotten richer in like sort of absolute terms, I guess, if that analogy makes sense. But just really quickly. There was an interesting paper called the Scandinavian Fantasy that looked at income mobility in Denmark and the US. And basically what it found is that before taking into account taxes and transfers, the US has greater, or they have about even income or economic mobility, but after taking into account taxes and transfer, Denmark has much greater economic mobility because of welfare. And it seems like even in absolute terms, people are able to get richer and able to like start businesses and be more innovative because of more social spending. So it's not just like a statistical illusion brought about by less inequality.
This next one coming in from Bubblegum Gun says, the existence of the state is against everything Brook says. There is no such thing as free market under the state. Fascism is just the price we pay. I'll give you a chance to respond to that if you'd like, Yaron.
Sure, it's off the debate topic, but there is no such thing as free markets without the state. I am not an anarchist. Anarchism is the dissolution of markets into gang warfare and violence, and it is abhorrent.
Gotcha. And Jacob Carlin says, for Mouthy, have you ever heard of Hong Kong? No welfare there.
Yeah, so again, I'm not going to, this was a point that was also brought up earlier, which is that you can see, well, first of all, I don't agree with the idea that Hong Kong has absolutely no welfare. I don't know if any countries have zero, like literally zero welfare or zero social spending. But I do think that like you can have significant reductions in poverty through like market mechanisms and so on. I'm not denying that empirical fact, but what I am saying is that market mechanisms seem to reduce poverty. Social spending along with market mechanisms seem to reduce poverty more than just market mechanisms alone could. So yeah, that's I guess all I'd say about that.
Can I just say this? All poverty is reduced by market mechanism, because even welfare is taking money from the market. It's taking money from the producers in the marketplace, wealth that was created in the marketplace and redistributed. So when you don't have a marketplace, you have zero reduction in poverty, because somebody has to create the wealth to redistribute. And my point is that somebody who creates the wealth should have the say in how that wealth is used, and that majorities should not be in a position to dictate to individuals how their wealth should be used.
Yeah, of course, I do agree with the first point. I disagree with the second point. I do think that without markets, you're not going to have as good of a welfare state. Of course, I think markets are really important for productivity and growth. Whether or not you want to say that the resulting reduction in poverty from welfare is just a product of markets, or whether we should just say that's because of markets as well, I think it's sort of like a semantic issue. But the fundamental point I'm making is that markets plus welfare, I think, reduces poverty more than just markets could. I disagree with the morals, of course, for reasons we started earlier. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Sorry for rushing you guys. I seriously hate doing that. It's just that we have a lot of great questions I want to squeeze in and still respect your guys' time. Sigma Any said, Sigma uses voluntary donation. It's super effective. Thank you for that. And Brandon Arlene says, Yaron, how do you feel about taxes being used to equip poor people with the education and resources needed to rise out of poverty?
As I already said, I think it's a disaster. I don't think tax money should be used to give anybody anything. That is, tax money should be used. I mean, there should be no coercive taxation. The government should do one thing and one thing only, and that is to protect our rights, to protect our freedoms. So there should be a police, a military, and a judicial system, and that is it. Education is far too important, as is healthcare, to be granted to a government monopoly. We can see what happens when you have that government monopoly. The product is awful, and the customer turns out to be not the students. The customer turns out to be the teachers. The teachers rule the day, You can see that with COVID, with schools shutting down and being closed and continue to be closed, in spite of the fact that it's not good for the kids, because nobody cares about the kids. It's not about the kids. So I am a huge advocate for improving education by privatizing it, by eliminating the state control over it, certainly its production. The best way to equip people to rise up from poverty is to give them a great education. The best way to get them a great education is to create a competitive educational system that actually produces results.
Gotcha. And Chandler Saunders says, so should we lower the standard for poverty in our country like China did so that the number of those in poverty dramatically drops overnight?
No, I mean, that's silly, right? We shouldn't, I don't know that we should measure poverty. I don't know what the value of measuring poverty is. What I want to measure is freedom. What I want is to leave people free to pursue their own opportunities, including poor people. You know what you could do to help poverty? You could eliminate licensing laws. You could eliminate the massive difficulties to open businesses. You want to open a nail salon? The unbelievable amount of costs and effort you have to go into, bureaucratic. It can take 2 years to get a license to open a business in a poor neighborhood. So you want to help poor people get rid of all the obstacles, and the obstacles are all created by the state. The obstacles are all created by regulations. And one of the obstacles, in my view, is the existence of a paycheck if I just sit at home and don't do anything. And that's an obstacle to people actually rising out of poverty.
Gotcha. And Super K-Pill says, Mouthy, what about the moral argument that it's simply wrong to forcefully take wealth from some and give it to others?
Yeah, so like I said, my sort of moral framework is that I want the best possible world for myself. I'm motivated by my own self-interest. I think that everyone else fundamentally is motivated by their own self-interest. And I think that everybody, or generally the vast majority of people's self-interest, mine included, can be most well met in a society with welfare. I fundamentally am happier with my life, and I think most people are happier with their life when they're less likely to sink into deep poverty at some point in their life, when they're less likely to have like a family member in poverty, when they're less likely to be, assaulted on the street because of higher poverty leading to higher crime, when they're in a society that's more cohesive and has stronger growth. So I disagree with Yaron's fundamental premise that coercion is fundamentally antithetical to our self-interest, because I think coercive structures can actually serve the self-interest of the vast majority of people in society. And I think we can see this sort of empirically. Yeah. Sorry.
Let me just quickly note that in the 19th century in the United States, one could buy insurance against poverty, one's own poverty. One could buy in the private markets all kinds of mechanisms, if one was responsible enough, to secure one's ability to survive if bad stuff happened to oneself. The difference is that then it is you taking action, your responsibility, your voluntary transaction in order to engage in making sure you don't get poor, versus this coercive collectivization and treating everybody the same, rather than letting individuals be individuals and making their own choices in life.
Yeah, so really, really quickly. So I guess I think that, so it's true that you could have some forms of insurance in like 1968, for example, in the United States, but it's also the case that, as we've, ramped up social spending since 1968, poverty has decreased. So it seems like, and of course, from the, cross-country correlations between poverty and welfare, we can see that these sorts of dynamic effects that you are referring to don't properly compensate for a good, successful welfare state. And when it comes to, it's your responsibility. I guess just fundamentally, I don't inherently care about things being voluntary. I care about things being voluntary insofar as something being voluntary serves the self-interest of people in society. And I think that some coercive structures that are not voluntary in the sense that you mean the word voluntary can be conducive to people's self-interest.
We've got one from Super K-Pill.
Use people's self-interest. Not what I view as people's self-interest.
Sure.
And the only way for us to resolve it is by force. The only way to resolve it is through coercion. And that
I think so.
Right?
We've got Super K-Pill who asks, this one for Yaron, they say devil's advocate question. Are you in favor of raising minimum wage to $15 since you're against welfare?
No, I mean, of course not. I'm against any minimum wage. Minimum wage should be lowered to zero. And minimum wage is the government intervening in a voluntary exchange between an employer and employee. The government has no business in that exchange. It is immoral to force people to pay a certain amount or to accept. And it's only rich people like minimum wages because, they send their kids to do internships that get paid exactly zero. Poor kids are not allowed to do internships. Only rich kids are allowed to do internships. Poor kids have to be paid $15, so they never get the job. No, the empirical studies, and I know, the empirical studies are overwhelming in terms of the negative effects of minimum wages. Now, yes, there's one or two studies that show counter results, but those studies are being challenged and refuted. The overwhelming majority of the empirical evidence out there shows that minimum wage is harmful to the people who need the minimum wage. That is, it makes it more difficult for the poorest of the poor, or the people who have the wrong color skin, or whatever it is. They have a disability, they're ex-cons. There's a multitude of ways in which people discriminate against people once you increase minimum wage. And there's no accident that the minimum wage was a racist policy instituted by white unions to keep blacks from getting jobs as they migrated north during the 20s and 30s, I think. And they didn't want the wage competitions. They instituted a minimum wage to keep their jobs. And that's what it is today. It's to protect unions and others from competition.
Robert Nasir has a question, and this one, some of these, as both of you have noticed, these are things you've kind of already addressed. So if you want, you can add like an extra tidbit in terms of answering this. I think Mouthy, you probably just answered this roughly. Robert asked, by what right does anyone seek to impose by government force their view of, quote, the good society on those who ask nothing more than to be left free to live by their own best judgment?
Yeah, so I guess this is sort of where I'll use my opportunity to sort of respond to what Yaron was saying to my answer to the last question to this effect, which is that I agree that, so when you said like by your standard of self-interest, it is coercion can be good, but not by mine. I think that so there's sort of two things that you could mean by that. I think in the first sense, I think that there is sort of almost objective ways to measure what is conducive to people's well-being. Like, for example, I reject the idea that there is a large swath of society who just enjoys being sick and in pain and in poverty all the time. So I think there are generally like certain like objective metrics that we can use to examine people's well-being. And I think that we can show that like the kinds of policies that I advocate for, or at least I think so, obviously you would disagree, and this was kind of the point of the debate, but I think that the kinds of policies that I advocate for do increase these objective measures of well-being for the vast majority of people in society. Now, I think that you're right in that some people might disagree, right? Like there might be, I'm not calling like you psychopathic or something, but there could be like a psychopathic billionaire who enjoys seeing people starve, and their self-interest might be contradicted by welfare. But I think that these kinds of people just fundamentally, I don't care about like these kinds of people. I think that I want to create the most successful society possible. And if people have interests that are antithetical to that, they either are going to have to leave or just accept the coercion, I guess, which is obviously sounds very morally abhorrent to you, but I guess we just,
well, but
also in that respect.
It's I'm not going to defend a billionaire who enjoys, I'm not going to defend anybody who enjoys seeing people in poverty. I think that is not a right counterfactual to use. The fact is that there might be people who think that they could use their money instead of having it taken by the state to promote their own happiness better than your view of how to promote my happiness, which is to reduce poverty. It might be that I believe that reducing poverty is good for me, and then I can put money into your collective, action pool. It might be that I believe that it could be otherwise. It also is true that I think that poverty is reduced much more through no welfare than through the engagement of it. But much more important to me is you don't have a right, and I don't care what kind of measures you have. How do you measure my suffering, if you will, from having 50% of my income taken away from me, from somebody else's benefit, whatever it happens to be? How do you do that measurement? You can't. You can say it's not good for people to be sick. Okay. You can say it's not good for people to be poor. Okay. But you don't have a measure of, I don't know what, the suffering and the pain versus the pleasure and the happiness or whatever, all of that. And you don't have a right to engage in that kind of math anyway. Imagine if you had that measure. And now we had kind of a meter where we, Yaron, you shouldn't be doing this debate. You should be right now working at the soup kitchen. So go off, I've got a gun to the back of your head, because the soup kitchen is actually going to make you happier. If you work in the soup kitchen, or you should have been a doctor, Yaron, you shouldn't have gone into finance or into, intellectual life. You should have been what Mouthy thinks you should have been, because Mouthy has run the algorithm, and Mouthy knows that you would be happier if only you'd done X, Y, and Z. I mean, this is the problem with all forms of central planning. You don't know what's good for me. You can't tell what's good for me. You don't know, even with a poor person, you don't know if giving them $100 or leaving them alone is better for them, objectively better for them. You actually don't know. You cannot measure those kind of things, and you don't have the counterfactual. You could do the statistics, but you don't actually have the parallel universe in which you didn't give them the $100, and you saw that maybe they worked hard and got a job and were incredibly successful and did amazing things with their lives and achieved far greater happiness for themselves and for 5 generations following them, because their kids benefit from all that as well, rather than me stuck as a welfare mother or father. So all of that is you putting yourself and your values and imposing them on other individuals and doing some kind of measurement and aggregating them across all of that. And I think that's what's abhorrent about this whole mechanism. And that's why I'm against I'm against coercion, I'm against coercion no matter what, but I'm certainly against coercion when it's clear to me that you don't know what my values are, and you don't know what anybody's values are except your own.
We've got a few questions.
Yeah, so really, can I just give a really pithy response to that? Okay. So yeah. So I guess when you say I might not like welfare might be antithetical to my interests. I sort of think that I think that whoever's saying that is going to usually be wrong in the vast majority of cases, because I think that the vast majority of people do objectively benefit from having coercive things like welfare that I think make society flourish more in general. You talk about how I don't have a measurement for this. I think we can use certain measurements like the health of a population, how content a population reports being with their lives, social cohesion, happiness. I think there are certain metrics we can use to see whether or not on the aggregate the policies I'm advocating for make society flourish more for the vast majority of people. We can use social mobility if you want. And I think that the data tends to suggest that the kinds of policies that I advocate for do have this effect. And I do think it's justified to coerce people away from what they otherwise would have done if doing so makes the vast majority of the population able to pursue their own self-interest more and make society flourish more.
I hate to push in, but just because
Sure.
the original question was to Mouthy, and so we'll jump to the next one, but do want to rush through a couple of quick ones, and then we might be able to squeeze in maybe 1 or 2 more, you could say, questions per se. But this one comes from the optimistic pessimist, who says, can you please set up a debate with Yaron Brook and Destiny or Vosh? We'll sure try, folks. And then also one similar to that in terms of debate requests. Corey Flores said, thanks for your generous super chat, by the way. Corey said, I'd love a round 2 on statistics, especially the one cited by Mouthy in this debate. I'd like to see someone who has studied statistics like Yaron. By the way, I didn't know that it was Dr. Brook. I just learned that. But Yaron, they said, I'd love to see...
Don't call me Dr. Brook, but yes, I do have a PhD.
They said, would love to see Yaron give his take on those stats, as Yaron seemed ready to take on this debate morally, whereas Mouthy was ready statistically. So that could be juicy. And so thank you very much for your question. This one, as we said, we're a little bit over time. So I do want to just maybe get 1 or 2 more in. Duncan Curry said, everyone knows that feeding squirrels at the park makes them dependent and is harmful. Doesn't the same apply to a more complex animal such as humans?
This is the JF argument.
Doesn't welfare love our fellow humans to death? What is the difference?
Yeah, so I guess like my counter argument is that it just seems to be based on the data that I've engaged with regards to unconditional cash transfers. It seems to be that rather than making people dependent and leading to them work less, it actually leads to people working more. And you can see this for the people who received the unconditional cash transfer in Stockton, California, because people receiving additional money gives them the breathing room that they need. It's because they're sort of trapped by sort of day-to-day hassles and bills that make it harder for them to focus on the future, focus on going to school to get a better job or move to a different neighborhood maybe, and sort of having that additional cushion to sort of take care of like the, bare subsistence needs of life gives people the breathing room that they need to sort of focus more on the future and ultimately become productive members of society. So that's sort of my counter narrative to that narrative. And mine seems to be corroborated by the evidence that I've engaged with.
So notice how we treat the productive members of society as these sacrificial animals. Not only are they going to have to fund people in their lives to give them enough room and enough time to do whatever they want to do and so on, and then they have to provide the jobs and they have to create the businesses. One of the powerful messages in Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged is, what if those people stopped? What if they stopped? What if they said enough of just milking us dry because this individual here is going to be a little bit better than that individual? No, I don't want to give it to that individual. The whole system collapses. I have to say something about social cohesion. The welfare state was invented in Germany by Bismarck. That same country went on to start really 2 world wars. Massacre millions and millions of people. The fact that it was a welfare state, all of it was a welfare state. Throughout the post-Bismarck era was a welfare state. Didn't change the fact that it led to wars, destruction. I would argue the exact opposite. That capitalism, freedom, a reduction in the idea that some people owe other people a living somehow, that somehow we have to maximize social well-being, social cohesion. It's exactly this kind of thinking: the public interest, the good, the welfare, the good of everybody, utilitarian calculus. All of that is what leads us into warfare. It what leads us into strife. It's what leads us into conflict. Indeed, it is the lack of social cohesion in America today is not a consequence of too little welfare. I would argue it's a consequence of a mentality of expectations of welfare. It's a mentality of people sitting on their and doing nothing to make their own lives better, and expecting the steel job to come home from China, expecting to have a job in Cincinnati when there's a job 2 states over, but who the hell is going to get in the car and drive 2 states over when my welfare check is associated with Ohio, and in Arkansas, I might not get that welfare check. I mean, there's so many stories of people who don't do the minimal that they need to do in order to go get a job, because our intellectuals, our culture, and our welfare system has created passivity and a lack of personal responsibility and a willingness to just sit around and wait and blame the other. Who do we blame for all the problems in this country? We blame foreigners, we blame Chinese, we blame immigrants, we blame everybody, except the fact that our own people won't get up and actually go and do their jobs. So no, I think that lack of social cohesion in America is a consequence of the welfare state. Now, you'll give me the counterfactual of what about Denmark and Sweden and all those wonderful countries? As I said, as somebody who's visited Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Norway many times, particularly Sweden and Denmark, particularly Denmark, researchers like to overestimate the social cohesion over there. And there's a massive selection bias in terms of who stays and who goes, particularly successful people leaving. But I would love to run an experiment. This is the experiment I would love to run. And I wonder what Mouthy thinks of this experiment. I would like to have open borders. I'd like to have, generally, I'm pro-immigration, but I would like to eliminate all barriers to immigration between the United States, Switzerland, Sweden, and Denmark. And I would like, I'm curious what people think, what the flow of immigration would be. Now, I'm willing to put a lot of money on the bet that the flow of immigration would be from Scandinavia to the United States, not the other way around, in spite of the greater social spending in Scandinavia. And it won't be a little immigration. It won't be a trickle. It would be a flood. And it would be primarily poor people immigrating from Scandinavia to the United States. Because the United States, in spite of all its problems, still has more opportunities than Scandinavia does to rise up and be successful. Social mobility in Scandinavia is no big deal. But if you can make it in America, still, and it's becoming less and less the case, but still, you've really made it in life.
We'll give you a quick response, Mouthy, and then we'll go to the last question before we say goodbye.
Thank you. So, so I guess a few points. So you talked about what if the rich just stopped because of social spending? And I think that, of course, that would be bad. But, I think that we've seen across the world that we can have, very robust levels of social spending without the rich just, up and leaving and, not creating any more jobs or not being productive anymore. And even if we were to prove that at some point, if we tax too much, and I'm sure there is such a point, if we tax too much and is redistributed too much, the rich would just leave. I would still make the argument that it would still be good to do social spending up to a point before we reach that maximum limit, right? You talked about how in Germany it seemed that welfare actually reduced social cohesion. I'm not sure. I think that there can be a lot of factors that influence social cohesion in a country. So I guess I'm just skeptical of saying that there was a lot of welfare here and there was low social cohesion, so therefore this must have been the cause. I generally try to look at broader, I guess, sample sets and try to do more specific analysis. So I guess I'm just sort of skeptical of that. In terms of the idea that welfare has created a culture of expectation of welfare in the US and that this actually decreases social cohesion, I think that I don't really buy into this narrative, especially because the US has one of the most stringent and, workfare-based welfare systems in the world. Our biggest programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit, you have to work in order to receive them. And this seems to be the case with a lot of our programs. And if we look to other countries, even if, because you said we should just, get out of, Sweden, get out of Denmark, get out of Norway, sure, we can do that. But even if we look at broader correlations, it seems like reductions of inequality across the world, even when you just discount these countries, seem to be correlated with increases in social cohesion. And I don't think that we would see that if the concept of welfare leads to this culture of expectation. And I think that the idea of a culture of expectation is also undercut by the idea that we can see things like increases in social spending leading to more entrepreneurship. Like entrepreneurship in the Nordic countries where social spending is very high, according to the OECD Enterprise Birth Index, is actually higher than it is in the United States. And Gareth Olds has done a lot of work that is corroborating this as well. And I guess finally, I disagree with the idea that the U.S. has less opportunity. I think that the Nordic countries have better employment, higher rates of entrepreneurship. I think they have plenty of opportunity there despite their high social spending.
We must go to this final question. Ben Miller, thank you very much, said, Yaron, how can you keep pointing to countries like China and South Korea that have gone to great lengths to reduce poverty with zero social spending, quote unquote, when they all have free public health care?
China doesn't. China does not. If you can't pay for healthcare in China, you die in the street. There's no charity and there's no free public healthcare in China. South Korea does, but China does not. By the way, no healthcare is free. Healthcare is paid for through taxes, through coercion. And a big chunk of the healthcare expenditure in places like Europe and South Korea and all the socialized healthcare countries is paid for by American taxpayers. We are basically subsidizing the healthcare of the rest of the world. The rest of the world is free riding off of American healthcare. 70+% of all medical innovations happening, it's 60+% of all healthcare innovations happen in the United States because we still have a little bit of freedom in healthcare, and they free ride off of that. We pay higher prices on drugs so that drug companies can do research and development. They pay basically cost on drugs. So drug companies don't make any money from other countries to fund research and development. They have to make all their research and development money in the United States. That's also true of Swiss, European drug companies. European drug companies make their money in the US, subsidize Europe. So we are basically subsidizing the healthcare of the rest of the planet. The worst thing that could happen to healthcare in South Korea and in Europe would be for the United States to socialize its healthcare system. That would devastate healthcare systems all over the world because they wouldn't have the sacrificial lamb to sacrifice anymore, to milk. And it's the same argument. Mouthy just said, yeah, we're going to tax businessmen up to the point just before they leave, right? Or they reduce their production. Well, yeah, I mean, that's the attitude. The attitude is that they're not individuals. They don't have their own values and utility functions. They don't have their own ability to make choices about their own life and how to spend their own money. We, collective we, have decided that their money is best spent on welfare reduction, and therefore we are going to take as much of it as we can get away with in order to reduce poverty. And to me, that's immoral, and it's bad economics, because one of the things you're not measuring is, and again, you're going to do cross-sectional analysis across countries, which I think is dubious throughout. But what you're not measuring is what those rich people would have done with their money. You're not measuring, if you take Elon Musk's money, do we get to Mars in 10 years? Is it a good thing to go to Mars by 2030? Will poor people benefit from the ability to go to Mars in 2030? Is it good for humanity? What's the value of that? But if you tax Elon Musk up to a certain point, we won't go to Mars. So, and my guess is there are a lot of going to Mars-like projects that we have not done because wealthy people have been taxed up to the point where they didn't have the kind of volume, the wealth in order to engage in those kind of massive investments. So again, we're assuming a static world in which every country has a welfare state. We're assuming that the differences between these countries are minor. We're controlling for welfare, but we're not controlling for levels of regulations and other things. We're controlling for, we're doing statistics, which in my view, often very, very dubious. But even if they were all true, you can't actually run the experiment where people weren't forced to give up their money and where other stuff happened, and you're using a bad morality to inflict great pain on humanity, in my view.
Can I just give like a really quick response? Because I think this is a very important part. So in terms of Elon Musk, I'm skeptical that Elon Musk is going to take us to Mars. It seems like Elon Musk is more focused on reinventing the subway, but more inconvenient at the moment. And in terms of the idea of, an opportunity cost, it seems that there might be some opportunity cost to, if you take somebody's money, they're less likely to do productive things with it. But you also have to take into account that the idea that, if we give other people money, now they have a greater capacity to do greater things as well. If you give someone more economic security, less shield them more from economic risk, they have, give them welfare that allows them to save more for investment. They're more likely to be a poor person is more likely to be able to start a business. If you shield them from the anxieties and the stresses of poverty, they're more likely to be able to innovate or do something productive with their lives. And I think this is generally borne out.
We do want to say there's one last super chat. Corey Flores says, also, Yaron, please unban me. So, I don't know what that story is.
I've tried, Corey. I really have tried, but I can't figure out on YouTube how to unban somebody once you. I apologize. I screwed up. I banned him by accident. I can't quite figure out how to So if somebody out there has the technical knowledge of how to unban somebody on YouTube, please get in touch with me and let me know, and I'd be happy to unban Corey. Let me just say,
sorry. Maybe Elon Musk will invent the unbanning technology.
I find it dubious that anybody should speculate on what Elon Musk can and cannot do, or will not do, or should or should not do. But let me also, just as a caveat for the listeners, but also for Mouthy, I am very, very, very skeptical about any research that shows there's more entrepreneurship in Scandinavia than there is in the United States. I would look at other research that maybe has different results. As far as I know, the two most entrepreneurial places right now the United States and Israel, and Scandinavia lags behind. But go look at the empirical evidence and check it out. But because one social thinker, and given that I wrote a book on inequality, I've seen a lot of Nobel Prize winners do crummy statistics. There's a whole book called Das Kapital for the 21st Century by
Thomas Piketty,
which is garbage on stilts from a statistical and data perspective, and it gets raved about constantly. So be quite skeptical about these statistics, particularly when there's a political agenda behind them.
Yeah, so I'm not citing like an academic paper this time or anything. I'm just citing the OECD Enterprise or the OECD Enterprise Birth Index, which I generally think is like a pretty credible source, and it generally shows that there are more business startups in than in the Nordic countries than in the U.S. And I think Gareth Olds additionally has done work showing that even just within the U.S., programs like food stamps and Medicare have been shown to increase business startups by giving people more economic security and so on.
We want to let you know, folks, our guests are linked in the description. Please do check out their links, as we have really appreciated our guests, and want to say a huge thank you both to Yaron as well as to Ethan, Mouthy Infidel. It has been a true pleasure. And so, folks, I'll be back in just a minute or so with a post-credit scene on upcoming debates for Modern Day Debate, and want to say one last thank you, though, to our guests. It's been a true pleasure to have both of you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, this was fun.
Absolutely. So with that, I'll be back in just a moment. As mentioned, folks, that was a blast. Want to say another huge thank you to our guests. Both Yaron and Ethan, or Mouthy Infidel, are linked in the description. And so, folks, I'm guessing that you're still here. You must have enjoyed this debate. And so, I'd even encourage you, not just the side that you agree with in this debate, but even the side that you don't agree with, you can click on their link as well and consider that. I mean, it's valuable because, hey, it's good to be acquainted with the arguments from, you could say, the opposing side on whatever issue it is. I mean, it would be a sad thing to only have a great depth of the arguments for your position. It's good to have a great depth of familiarity with the arguments against your position. It's absolutely essential, folks. So with that, do want to say first couple of things in terms of upcoming debates that we are excited about, as well as get to say hello to people in the chat. See a lot of new people in the chat, which is exciting. So Stephanie Bond, thanks for coming by. Mark Reeves, really glad you're with us. Robert Nasir, thanks for coming by. And Wonder Freeman, thanks for coming by. Thanks for your thumbs up. Appreciate it. That's right. If you enjoyed this debate, want to let you know, you probably like long-form content. we are on podcast, and this debate will be loaded onto the podcast shortly. And want to let you know, we have all of our debates uploaded to the podcast. So, hey, if you haven't already, if you haven't found Modern Day Debate on podcast, pull out your phone now or pull up your favorite podcast app on your phone and find Modern Day Debate, as we're really excited as we've got both political, religion, and atheism, all types of debates, science debates, you name it. We have some kooky debates too, like Bigfoot type stuff, if that's what you like. So I do want to say hi though. So Super K Pill, thanks for being with us. Bubblegum Gun, thanks for coming by. And Luigi Capola, good to see you. I'm like, how many of these are some sort of improper innuendos? I can't tell. But anyway, Gail Parker, thanks for coming by. We're glad you are here. Gene Walters, appreciate you coming by. And we want you to know, Modern Day Debate is a neutral platform, hosting debates on science, religion, and politics. And we hope you feel welcome no matter what walk of life you're from, folks. For real. Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, Atheist, Christian, Muslim, you name it. We hope everybody feels welcome here. And so we're glad you're hanging out with us. And other stuff about the channel, we are really excited about the future. I told you that we have some upcoming debates, and I had mentioned this one already. Destiny and Pogan, I just heard from Destiny today, as we're really looking forward to that debate this coming Tuesday. Capitalism versus Marxism. You don't want to miss it. Believe me. Also, though, you guys, we have a lot. This upcoming week is just jam-packed with epic debates. So let me tell you about some of these. One, we told you we have kooky debates. If you didn't believe me, let me tell you about this one. On Wednesday, Rose and Alex Stein will be arguing. You guessed it. They are arguing that there are two suns and that NASA is covering one of them up. So we do have those types of debates. You're like, what kind of channel is this? But we do have, we'll let anybody make their case. We've got flat earth debates. I mean, like, we're like, hey, it's like, if the views are that insane that it's like, well, what's the harm in platforming them? They'll just get exposed anyway if we, platform these interesting, controversial ideas. So we have no apology. So Jonathan Sheffield and Dr. Boyce, as well as Dr. Josh and Jim Majors, will be here debating on Friday on the Book of Daniel, prophecy or forgery. So that should be a lot of fun. And then maybe 1 week from today, I have gotten in touch with the YouTube and Twitch streamer, Demon Mama, and we might be hosting a debate between T-Jump and Demon Mama on deplatforming. Tom takes a view that, hey, I'm not for deplatforming. As a blanket rule, blanket statement, I would say no. Like, I don't think it's any good. I think it's even bad in some cases. And Demon Mama would say, well, I think there are some cases where it's actually good to deplatform. And so that debate is in the works. It's not confirmed. So I want you to know that Demon Mama is mulling it over. Please don't pressure any of the speakers either, because sometimes we do announce debates that are like in the works, and we don't want you to pressure anybody. I don't think you guys would, but I don't want them to be like, oh, James, like, I didn't say I for sure would do it. Why do people think that? So I'm just saying it's just in the works. We're attempting to set that up. But Nocturnal Prelude, good to see you. And Dr. Truth, thanks for coming by, as well as Mr. C. And Gene Walters, good to see you. Apollo Zeus, thanks for coming by. Dave Langer said it was a great debate. Don't think anyone talked over the other person once. That rarely ever happens. I agree. That was great. Both of them really professional, really friendly, and Fresh Tree. Glad you're here as well. And I'd agree. We rarely really have a dumpster fire. Like, most of our debates are actually quite civil. And so when people are like, oh, we're gonna, offer this alternative on YouTube where it's like civil discussions, and it's like, but like there are plenty of them out there, actually. So we, Apricot Sloth, are glad to have you here. And also, let's see. Nate Main, glad you made it, says, hello, guys. We're glad you came by. Nate, hope you're doing well. Thanks, Tuss Beatbox, for your feedback. Says, great setup, James. Really like this debate. All credit to the speakers. We are so thrilled and thankful that they came on. So both Yaron and I almost said Nephilim Free. Why am I thinking about Nephilim Free? Yaron and Mouthy Infidel are linked in the description, and so you can hear more from them, as well as read more from them, and that's in the description, whether you're listening via YouTube or podcast. Also, Hatsakun, thank you for coming by. We're glad you're here. Adam Elbilia, good to see you. Staying up late with us, Adam. We like it. Bad to the bone. You're in Israel, right? Well, we're glad you're here, and thanks for staying up late with us. It's got to be super late there. So, Nocturnal Prelude says, smash that like button. Please do. It helps the stream. That's the word on the streets, is that it allegedly helps with the algorithms. I would think it probably does, right? Because it gives maybe it's a small, it's one of the pieces of the puzzle that leads the algorithm, you could say. Sigma Annie says, I think James won this debate. That's funny. I won by just getting to enjoy it so much because we were really thankful for our guests, and that was honestly phenomenal. I'm so excited to see people's positive feedback in the chat that people really enjoyed it, and that the likes, I think we're at 189 likes, which is awesome. That's really good. So people really enjoyed that. Shazbot, thanks so much for coming by. And you're right, Shazbot said, what about the guy whose question wasn't asked? That's you among two or so other people. Some of them want to be fair, email me at moderndaydebate@gmail.com because we don't want to leave you out to dry. We do appreciate when you give a super chat, and so if it doesn't get read, frankly, I do want to send it back via PayPal or Venmo, something like that. And so I also want to say, if it's your first time here, want to remind you that sometimes there's a point in the debate where I'll pin a chat and it'll say hey folks, I'm really sorry we can't take any more questions. We've got too little time. And so I just want to, like I said, I'm happy to send you that super chat value back because we just appreciate that you're willing to do a super chat. And we always want to read them. And so when we don't get to read them, it's hey, I get where you're coming from. Shoot me an email at moderndaydebate@gmail.com and I'll send that value back. It's the same amount for the super chat. But do want to mention that basically we do try to give people a heads up where the speakers have, their time is valuable. We want to honor that. And so sometimes we have to stop before we get to read all the questions. And it's just, my estimation, frankly, is not always great in terms of knowing how many we're going to get to read. So I'm still work in progress. I'm a work in progress. Brandon Gray says best, but yeah, thanks for coming by, Brandon Gray. And Perfect One, good to see you. And Stuck in Florida, good to see you again. And let's see. Stefan Burns, thanks for coming by. Said, great debate. I'm so glad you liked it, Stefan. And is it Michael or Mikkel? I think it's Michael. We were glad you were here, Michael. And RDF, thanks for coming by, as well as, I'm almost caught up. Hannah Anderson, good to see you, as well as, let's see, Nero, good to see you again. Apollo Zeus, thanks for coming by. And let's see. So, Steve Coates said, still a possible AJ appearance. That's possible. Shazbot, thanks so much. That's kind of you to say you're not worried about the super chat balance. I totally appreciate it. I want you to know that I was it was so hard to get questions in because I love that our guests are spirited. And so both of them wanted to share as many of the things that they've read, which is the value of the channel. That's what makes the channel fun, and you get to learn the best of each side. That's, in my opinion, why it's great. So yeah, thanks for your patience. As I remember seeing yours, and I was I want to read, but yeah, so sorry that we had run out of time. And so Brooke Chavez says, let's get to 200 likes. Thanks for your support. Appreciate that, Brooke, as well. And then Super K-Pill said, can they do a part 2? I'm open to it. Let me, see if that might be something they'd be interested, because I think that'd be fun. Adam Ilbilia says, yeah, bro, here in Israel currently 5 a.m. in the morning. Wow. Thanks for being up with us. Gail Parker says, bye, all. Take care, Gail. We hope you have a good night. Thanks for coming by. And the Analytic Synthetic Dichotomy says, good night, everybody. Thanks for saying good night, and we hope you have a great night. Nico Sammarino, thanks for coming by. And almost caught up with you guys. I'm chasing you down in the chat. It's moving fast. But Dylan James, thanks for coming by. Hope you're well. Barin Von G, glad you came by as well. And is it pronounced Onan? Thanks for coming by. AF Katie, thanks for coming by. Said, when is Avi coming back? That's a great question. No joke, Avi wants to debate Kent Hovind. So we do hope to host Kent Hovind and Avi next month, and by that I mean May. That would be epic. I've just got to find a date that works for both of them. So we really would like to do that. And so Brooke Chavez says, don't forget Twitch. You're right, Brooke. Thanks for your patience. Twitch fam, glad to see you. And Riley, good to see you. And Lucille, thank you for coming by. I see you there in the Twitch chat, as well as Brooke Sparrow. And that reminds me, yeah, folks, I don't know if you know that we have Twitch. We do, and we're live on Twitch right now. So I'll put that in the chat on YouTube if you want to access it, and you can see that as well. Dave Langer, good to see you, and Ms. Metal, good to see you. Poor Lucy, thanks for coming by, as well as Ozian, good to see you again, and Brooke Sparrow, and who else is all in there? It's like sneaking around. You say Lucille. Is it? Let me know if I'm pronouncing this right. Lucille. But thank you for your kind words. And Tapatzel, good to see you. Says James is watching. I am. Very voyeuristic of me. But let's see here. Oh, that our Twitch. Right there. All right. I just put that in the YouTube chat. And so thank you for your patience. If you dig good old Twitch, we are excited to be on there. And I'm excited that it's been growing like fast, which is just awesome. Like, we are so encouraged that the Twitch, like most of our followers have come just from this year, like the last few months. And so that's cool. And so, yeah, we're just glad that people like find it useful. So cool. And then Brandon Gray said, thanks for the debate. Heard about it. Too late. We'll listen later. It's cool to try to present the best argument of each side. Thank you for coming by. We appreciate it. And Sigma Eni says, good night all. Thanks, James. Thank you, Sigma Eni, for your support. Trillionaire says, this is a good debate. Now remove the ability of moderators to post their opinions mid-debate. Yeah, Trillionaire, the tricky thing is, I'm just like, we do have moderators that are across the spectrum, Christian, atheist, agnostic, politically left, politically right. And so I'm just like, do we want to do this to moderators? I like the moderators getting to be in the discussion, as long as they're not insulting the guests. We've always said we don't want moderators to do that. But if they want to critique arguments or something or give their own arguments, I'm like, I think that's okay. I mean, they're volunteering basically to the general rules we have in chat are pretty loose and easygoing. We only have like two firm rules. One, we're not going to let what would conventionally be known as hate speech. We're not going to let that fly. So we're going to delete that without warning. It's just going to be deleted. We also, if people are attacking the guests, if they're harassing the guests, we know it's not hate speech, but we also realize that it's not practical to allow people to trash or slander our guests in the chat. That's not practical. How is that a sustainable, why would any guest want to come back if people are just trashing them personally in the chat? If you're not wanting to come back because someone trashed your arguments, I'm kind of like, well, it's like the name of the game. That's what we do here. It's like the debaters do it, people in the chat do it. What's the problem? But so in that case, we would say that's allowed, obviously. But like I said, we don't want any sort of trashing or slandering people in the chat. And so that's the only thing the moderators, though, are basically getting rid of. So Riley asks, good to see you. And Reservoir of Gore says, hi, James. Any news on the 24-hour looping stream of your old debates? I might. This summer is when I would do it. It would be in May. So this has been a really busy semester, and I'm working on a lot of things. I think I told you guys I bought this over a year ago, and I'm embarrassed. It's so sad that I haven't set it up yet. So this is like a quality camera. This is a Canon Rebel. I don't really know much about cameras, but I do know that it is a high quality DSLR camera, which I've had sitting in a box for a year because I've just been so busy. And you guys are like, oh, it can't be that busy. It's like, it's tough sometimes because it's like the PhD by itself. A lot of my other PhD students, like my fellow PhD students in the program, they'll tell you, any PhD person can tell you, it's a bone-racking experience. It is really seriously exhausting. And so that by itself, I'm usually just running on fumes. And so the channel, it's like I'm trying to do new things. But anyway, long story short, I love the idea, Reservoir of Gore. So thank you for that idea. And Louis Preciado, good to see you. Thanks for saying hi. True Shoes 101 says, I love the Kent debates. And Charlie Sama says, good debate, lads. So glad you enjoyed it. Our guests are linked in the description as always. One thing that I sometimes find is that sometimes Wonder Freeman says, good audio quality. That's the first time I've ever heard that. Thank you. I appreciate that so much. For a year, it was like our first 2 years, our audio was terrible. It made me want to cry. But thank you for Baron Von G says, if James was a flavor of ice cream, he would be ice cream. So true. But yes, I want to say, you guys, we are really excited about the future of this channel. We always have. I want to let you know, if you're new to Modern Day Debate, it's always debates. There are no videos that are like let's say we hosted debates, but then we were also putting out videos that are like, hey, capitalism or socialism or whatever view you want, libertarianism. Like it's for sure, here are the best arguments for it, and it's obviously, the best way to go. It would be like, don't get me wrong, I don't think there's anything wrong with channels that do that, but for us, we were like, we're not going to do any of that. The reason being, it's like, if we're really a debate channel, we only do debates. And occasionally we'll put out a video like, hey, thank you everybody for your support and stuff, because we do appreciate your support. But other than those, those are the only exception, is we just host debates. Now, Dave Langer had a question in email. So thanks for your question, Dave. I think I didn't do a great job of explaining this. And one reason is because I remember explicitly I said two different things. And so that's why this is probably it's not super clear. When it comes to using people's preferred pronouns, here's the trick. One, even under YouTube's rules, I don't see it as hate speech. And so what we want to do is immediately just let the person know, just say, hey, this person that is debating on this channel doesn't want to be called that pronoun. And so we're not going to say that you have to call them their preferred pronoun if you want to put their name in a sentence and you just use their name all the time. So, like, you just say, like, Brooke said that Brooke is tired right now, instead of saying Brooke said that she is tired right now or he is tired right now. Like, we just ask that it's like, if you want to just use their name in a redundant way, like, that's okay. The idea is so we're not trying to force you to use any particular pronoun, but we also realize that sometimes people will call a person a pronoun other than what they want to be called because they're trying to, like, get to them. They're trying to get under their skin. And it's like, okay, we don't need that. Like, we want our guests to come back. And clearly you don't care about that because you're trying to, like, personally needle them by calling them a pronoun they don't want to be called. And so my thought is we will instantly give them a warning and say, hey, gotta let you know, like, we consider that, in the event that once in a while it might be the case that someone makes an accident where they're like, hey, is James born male or female? Like, or, is like James, and you use the pronoun she for me. Like, it might be an accident, whatever it is. That's why we're going to give them a warning, because it's like, hey, any other form of harassment, I would say we're going to say, hey, want to give you a heads up, like, we're not going to let you do that. And so let's see, we're going to say, hey, we're giving you a warning and a timeout as well. I think that we talked about that. So we'll give them a verbal warning to say, hey, seriously, we don't want people trying to needle or harass people like that in the chat. And so we're giving you a warning and we're timing you out, verbal warning, you could say, and we're timing you out. And if you do it again, you're just going to be banned. So, and I would just explain to them, I think people will understand it, that we're not, like, trying to enforce. We're not trying to say, like, this is the proper definition of hate speech, or this is the proper definition of this or that. It's purely like, hey, if you look like a malicious actor in the live chat, you're not going to get away with it, because it doesn't make sense that we would let people, these characters in the chat, which is, by the way, it's like 1% of people. It's a very, very tiny percent. But we're not going to let that 1% of people spoil the chance of us hosting someone again because they want to needle or harass somebody in the chat. And so that's why we have the rule. So hope that makes sense, folks. We are not, what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, like and so long story short, it's we're not trying to take because frankly, I'll be honest, there are some people on Twitter that blast modern day debate, and they're like, modern day debate, you're immoral, that's not far enough, that's not firm enough, or you're immoral, James, because modern day debate, you host JF, or you host this person or that person, and blah blah blah. And I'm like, I don't really care. But I think that there are some people where it's like, nah, I just don't, I'm not going to cave to them like all the stuff. We get a lot of deplatforming critics, and that's all right. It motivates me more, believe me, folks. There are some people that might get discouraged by that, but I'm telling you, like when people try to, where they're like, no, 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 we're going to try to like, oppose you or slow you down or whatever, because we're excited. Our goal, I think, is a reasonable goal. We have the vision of providing a neutral platform hosting debates on science, religion, and politics such that it's fair to everybody. That's our goal. And we think that's a great goal. So we're not ashamed of it. We're absolutely striving for it. And if people oppose us, we're like, no, no, no. Like, it doesn't discourage us. It gets us more excited. It's us against the world if it has to be, and we're going to keep on pushing. And I'm telling you guys, this isn't like, oh, this is like a fun hobby for a couple of years. I'm telling you, in 10 years, this platform is going to be ginormous. Like, it's going to be like, remember, and don't get me wrong, I'm excited and encouraged that right now we're at, like, I think it's 45,000 subscribers we just hit the other day, which is super encouraging. Thank you so much, everybody. And that's awesome because we're having an impact, and that's encouraging. But at the same time, someday, believe me, in like 10 years, we'll look back and we'll be like, you remember when we were a little channel and we were talking about, how someday we'd be big, and we had like 45,000 subscribers back then. We were just a little guy out there. Like, believe me. So let's see. Dave Langer says the example that came up the other night was someone was saying, oh, that is not female, that is a guy. Why does he keep saying he is a she? Yeah, that would be the same thing, Dave Langer. I would just say we're going to, what is it called? We're going to give him a timeout, and we're going to say, hey, what's the word I'm looking for? We're going to say, hey, we don't want you to harass people. So we're not going to let you harass somebody, no matter what way it is. If you're clearly trying to be a malevolent actor, if you're clearly trying to get under their skin by using pronouns they don't want to be called, then that's what it is ultimately about, is malevolent actors, people who are malicious in their intent. That's the kind of people where we're like, hey, we're not going to play around much. We're going to give you a timeout and let you know to stop harassing. And if you keep going, boom, you're banned. Then that's it. Like, we're not pulling you out of the ban box. So, which reminds me, I gotta let Yaron know about how to pull somebody out of the ban box. But anyway, let's see. Yep, Dave Langer, you're right. Thanks for asking, because I think it was really unclear the other night. Now, here's the thing. I think that regarding the harassment of guests, one thing that I think we should do is see this as a spectrum. So if they call, like last time we've seen somebody called Matt an Nazi, and whatever you think of Matt, he's not that. So we're not going to let people slander in the chat. That's, again, I would say let's give them a timeout and just say, hey, we're not going to let you slander people. You've got one chance to clean up your act. Otherwise, if you do it again, you're gone for good. And so now here's the thing. The only time when I would be more easygoing is, like, let's say it's something stupid. Like, let's say they're making fun of John Maddox because of his Flash hat, the comic book hero Flash, which, by the way, I don't know why people would make fun of that. But anyway, in that case, I would just say, like, let's not even time them out. If it's something petty like that, where it's like maybe it's somebody in like 7th grade who's watching and they're making fun of his hat, I would just say, hey, like, I don't know. I don't even know if I'd say anything. If they're making fun of somebody's like superhero hat, I just don't, like, I don't know if I'd say that's harassment. But what if they say it's like more serious? What if it's they say, look at Maddox's like bald head, so pathetic. What we would say is just kind of like, come on, like, we don't want you to harassing people's appearance and stuff like that. So I would just let them know, just say, hey, yeah, it's not what we're looking for. And you don't have to give them a timeout or anything. And then Baron Von G says, are we going to be required to say the correct pronoun? No, you're not. So if you are like, because there is a gray area, and by gray I mean like there is a way in which you can be agnostic. So you could be like, listen, I don't want to use their preferred pronoun. And I'm like, okay, you don't have to. Like, you can sit and watch, and you can even address them. So maybe you say, like I said, if you would normally say, like, hey, that debater, Becca, said that she or he doesn't like, strawberries. Well, my question is blah, 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 blah. You could just say, Becca says that Becca doesn't like strawberries. My question is blah, 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 blah. So just use their name, in the slot in which you would normally put a pronoun. Like, just use their name. So you can always put a noun wherever there's a pronoun. So Nocturnal Prelude said, no one said pronouns of speakers tonight. They just referred to their screen names. Yeah, that's the trick. And so it's like, I would just do that. And that way it's just not an issue, because then we don't have to take a stance on it. I don't want to take a stance on like what is hate speech and not. Like, that's not my goal of the channel. I think for us, I think it's a good enough reason to where I think it's frankly the reason that hopefully most people would understand, which is, one, we have this goal of providing a fair and neutral platform on YouTube. Fully fair, fairly neutral. We don't have any after shows where we like take the side of any particular, position or anything. And that, like I said, it's okay if channels do that. I don't think that's bad. But for us, like, we're radical about our neutrality. And so in pursuing that goal, if people are harassing people in the chat, no matter what way they do it, you're slowing us down in pursuing that goal. Because if people aren't going to come back, then, how are we supposed to have a debate channel? If it's just me here debating myself every night, you're not going to like it, people. So thank you guys. I'm going to let you go, but I hope everybody feels good about that. Hopefully it's clearer now, because I know the other night it was kind of like we were thinking out loud and it wasn't that clear. And so thanks for understanding, though, chat. I appreciate that you guys sound like you're pretty on board, and so that's encouraging. The Trillionaire doesn't like that mods have their opinions. We're willing, like, if you feel like, and this has been the case before, sometimes people are like, man, you have too many, because our flagship topic is like religion and atheism debates. If you feel like, oh, James, all you have is atheist or Christian or Republican or Democrat moderators, well, let me know if you're a person with a different view who wants to be a moderator, and I'll make you a mod. Like, that's cool. Like, so, because it's like, and then you can share your opinion as a mod. I don't really think it makes a big deal. Like, I don't think people who come here to the channel for the first time are like, oh, well, a moderator in chat says it, so it's got to be right. Forget what the debaters up there on screen are saying. Like, I don't know if it works like that. So I just don't think it's a big deal if moderators get to say, express their views. And so, like, you could say, like, partnering with us in we have different goals. That, like, in our relationship with the moderators, the goal is to get rid of hate speech and to stop harassment of the guests. And so, anyway, thanks for your kind words, Tuss Beatbox. Appreciate your kind words. And Adam Elbilia says, bye, buddy. I'm off. Thanks for the time and have a good night. Thanks, Adam. Appreciate it. Thanks for coming by, buddy. And, man, I had a great night of sleep last night. It was the first time in a long time, you guys, because I don't usually sleep super well, but last night I slept really well. It was great. I had a really memorable dream as well. Not something sexual, you perverts. But yeah, it was... I actually felt great today. I felt well rested, which is encouraging. So Dave Linger says, as long as the mods are following the rules, there shouldn't be an issue. Plus, mods are held to higher standards. Yeah, they are. I mean, you remember when what was it? I think it was Stupid Whore Energy. She went off on pagans one night. She was making fun of the pagans, the polytheists, the people who believe in more than one God. She was just trashing them, and we were like, sorry, you can't be a mod anymore. Thanks, Brooke Chavez said, I'm glad we're able to talk about the rules and figure this out. Me too. Hannah Anderson said, make me a mod. Let's see. I doubt you're like a libertarian or a conservative, but okay, I'll make you a mod if you want. So, I was saying that more because I think, and there's nothing wrong with this. It doesn't bother me. I think it's true that we have more politically left mods, and I think we have more atheist mods. and that doesn't bother me. It's not always going to be, it's very rarely going to be 50%, right? Because there's sometimes mods drop off and it's always going to be like, oh, there's maybe one group is like more strongly represented by another one. And I know that some of you, that would be enough to where you'd say there must be some sort of discrimination. It's like, no, I'm just like whoever wants to be a mod. Like, and so, let's see. So I know that correlation equals causation is the way a lot of people like to think. So like, oh, James, if there's so many atheist mods, or then it must be the case that you're discriminating against other people that want to be mods. Which really is, that's an example of correlation equals causation type reasoning. But I mean, I don't know. And then people will tell me like, oh no, James, like I'll teach you about that. And it's like, yeah, I mean, what do I know about it? But I'm being facetious. It really is. It's an example of correlation equals causation when they try to use it to say it's as if there's like some sort of favoritism or discrimination. But Dave Langer says, let's see, got that? And then, but it is nice to talk in here as a group and hear people's thoughts. So it is nice to just kind of like, hey, I like your guys's. Nate Main, I already said, man, if you just tell me that you want to be a mod, like I'm willing to have you be a mod. That's the way you apply. But yeah, basically, sorry, Nate, didn't mean to be mean to you. It's like, but yeah, well, at this point we've got like pretty much half the people in the chat are mods, but that's all right. But Hannah Anderson says, nope, I'm a libertarian, but I'm neutral in politics. Well, guess I was wrong. But yeah, basically, I am glad. It's nice to get your feedback for where the channel is going and how you think things should be. I do want you guys to have a say in that. This is like a true community, and so we do appreciate that. And so, thank you guys. I agree, Apricot Sloth, who says a person's religion isn't indicative of their ability to moderate. I agree. I mean, we've had atheist mods, we've had religious mods, and as long as they do it fairly, once in a great while, we have a speaker who's like, that person's going to moderate. Nope. I'm concerned. I'm bothered about this. And I'm like, why? Like their moderation seems good to me. It seems fair. And they're like, but it's their views. They hold these views, X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, I don't care what views they hold or don't hold. It's like, if they're moderating is fair, their moderating is fair. And that's just it. That's the answer. Like, so that's rare. But once in a while, I've seen that where I'm like, good, then there's no need for you to come on Modern Day Debate if you're going to be basically saying you won't you won't participate because the moderator's beliefs or lack of beliefs. I'm like, whatever. Dave Linger says you should really set up a Discord. Be a great place to get new viewers and also have room in the Discord for mods. We do have a Discord, Dave Langer. It's linked in the description. S.J. Thomason says, I'm an independent Christian. And then, let's see. Good to see you, by the way, S.J. All right, Nate. Nate Main. I've added you as a moderator. But yeah, do me a favor, yeah, like feel free being, saying to somebody, like if you see it looks like they're like harassing a guest, definitely just say, hey, just want to be sure, want to give a friendly reminder to attack the argument rather than the person. I think most people are pretty good about getting that feedback. In my experience, if I've like said anything to anybody, they're like, "Ooh, sorry about that," and then they are like totally cool. So, Vault, thanks for coming by. I see you there in the chat. Thanks, Tuss, for sharing our Discord link in the chat. I'm rarely active on Discord. I honestly, embarrassingly, don't know how to use it, but I can tell you that I am thankful for those who do all the moderating and all the work in the Discord. So we hope it's a value to you. We hope it's fun. So thank you guys. I hope you have a great rest of your night. That's right. They're contagious, SJ. Yawning and, interestingly, emotion. The research on emotion, you probably know this, SJ, but positivity, as an example, is contagious. So when you walk into a room and you're positive and pleasant, I'm not saying you per se, SJ, but I'm sure it works for you too. When a person walks into a room and they're positive and pleasant, it tends to be contagious. So Sideshow Nav says, oh yeah, plus 200 likes, keep them coming. And yes, please do hit that like button. We appreciate your support. If you buy into the vision, if you're like, hey, I like that. I like this idea of modern day debate and their goal of creating fairly moderated debates. If you're like, yeah, that sounds cool to me. I like that. I want to let you know I'm throwing that in the live chat as well. And this is namely our link to our Patreon if you want to join our Patreon, and we appreciate all of your support. And so thank you for all of your support. And I am going to pin that to the top of the chat as well. Thanks, everybody. Love you guys. Hope you know that just by being here, you make the channel more fun. The more the merrier. Seriously. It's really cool. We do appreciate you. We are thankful you're here. We hope you have a great rest of your night. We hope this is a fun community of different people from different walks of life. That's a beautiful thing, you guys. It really is. The idea is, if you have a group of people who are all, for example, Christian, or all atheist, or all liberal, or all conservative, or whatever it is, and they're all talking together, like the research is very clear, there's a tendency for groupthink where people will, kind of affirm each other to the point where they're, you could say, like less critical than maybe than would be good for the growth of the group. And so there is a good thing here in terms of our mix of people from different walks of life. And so that's a very good thing, a very beautiful thing. And Hats Ikan says, take care, James. Good showing. Thanks for your kind words and your encouragement. That means a lot. And so thanks for that, Hannah Anderson, who says, James, your interaction with the chat after the show is a game changer. Getting to know you better is everything. Thanks, Hannah. That means a lot. Seriously, that's really encouraging. And so that's, I enjoy this too. Like, this is fun for me. A lot of times I'm like, yeah, it's like sometimes it'll be an hour and I'm like, oh, it's like I gotta go to sleep soon. But thanks for hanging out, you guys. Do appreciate it. Love ya. Let me know. Shoot me an email at moderndaydebate@gmail.com if I can make your life better. For real, thanks. We hope that this channel's of value to you. We hope it's fun and enjoyable and a cool community. And so thanks, everybody. Thanks, AF Katie, who says, have a good night, y'all. Thanks, everybody. Nero says, bye, James. Still waiting for you to propose to me. I don't know who Nero is. Nero, aren't you Earl the postman from, like, Alabama? I'm flattered, but I mean. Brooke Chavez says, don't forget the Amazon link. We do have an Amazon link. That's right. Thanks, Brooke. Where is this thing? I've got it in here somewhere. There are ways that we share, like, in terms of how you can support modern day debate, and so we do appreciate all of your support. One thing that you can do is I don't know if you know that we have a free Twitch. If you have Amazon Prime, you have a free Twitch subscription you can use on any Twitch streamer that you want, and that includes us. And that helps us because it's an extra $2.50 toward the channel for the basically our funds, as we want to do a lot of in-person debates this summer. And so we're really excited to do some in-person debates this summer. We think it'll be epic. I think it'll be really fun. And so we do really, really want to say, I mean, you guys, for real, it's going to be fun and it's going to be epic. So we do want to encourage you for that. And that's the kind of thing is those funds, for example, would go Twitch, where basically your subscription, as I said, $2.50 a month. And if, let's say, we have 100 people do that, that's $250 that would come in a month. And what would that mean? Well, that's like a round trip flight, like a cheap round trip flight in the United States for us to do, like, to help basically make, let's say, a in-person debate happen. So that it adds up, if 100 people do it, that's a lot. That actually helps a lot. And we would love to do more in-person debates. And so let me get that Amazon link. I think I just shared it in the chat. So if you copy and paste that into your browser, or you might even be able to click on it, the way it works is like 3% of your purchase on Amazon helps Modern Day Debate. In other words, like 3% would go to Modern Day Debate if you use the Amazon link that I put in the pinned chat. And so that's like our Modern Day Debate portal. And so you'd pay the same price as normal, but like 3% goes to modern day debate, which helps. So thank you guys. We do really appreciate it. We hope you have a great rest of your night. Thanks for all your love and support. Seriously, appreciate it. And like I said, if there's something I can do to make your day easier, let me know. I'm at moderndaydebate@gmail.com. We love you guys. Appreciate you. Keep sifting out the reasonable from the unreasonable.